What's going on, folks? Hope everyone is well. Another edition of Boxing History every night. Joshua here, and salute to Random Acoustic Thoughts in the chat. Already dropped by, said something. We'll likely be hopping on in a bit as we discuss one of the premier heavyweights in boxing history, a guy with a small record relative to a number of the individuals who fought during his time. By small record, I mean number of fights and then overall years by which he fought. And that aside, he was still able to become a true standout in the sport. He was still able to become one of the great heavyweights that the sport has seen. And his legacy has essentially stood the test of time. And that is one James J. Jeffries, aka the Boilermaker. He's a name that when you think about heavyweight boxing history, even from more of a casual perspective, his name does stand out as well because most famously, I would say, was he took on Jack Johnson in what was considered to be the fight of the century, an early fight of the century in 1910, July 4th, 1910 to be exact. So just given the implications of such, with Johnson being the first black heavyweight champion, Jeffries being the individual who held the title prior to Johnson, and of course there were Tommy Burns and Marvin Hart there in the midst. But that being said, James J. Jeffries was the one that was regarded as the individual who could take on and defeat Jack Johnson, even with Johnson at his prowess. So, by virtue of that, and that fight actually taking place, then you had James J. Jeffries generate more of a name, even beyond just during his fighting years. So, very interesting fighter from an overall perspective. So, it'll be interesting as we dive into his career, look at some of those accomplishments, look at some of the fights that he participated in. And while I said it was a smaller career, it was most certainly one packed with a lot of punch, so to speak. Really quick, salute to Dan, says, how are you, Boss 86? Appreciate you, Dan. Appreciate you, as always. Always great having discussions with you on the channel, on the great boxing history, a number of these great fighters, these fantasy matchups, etc. Salute to you, Dan. Always sharing great information as well, so it's appreciated. And salute to Rodolfo Rivera Jr., who says, sup. Appreciate you being here, Rodolfo, as always. Always good to engage with you as well in discussion on the history of the sport. Yeah, so, you are appreciated there, Rodolfo, certainly. So thank you for dropping by. And sending your salutes to everyone else as well, to include Random Acoustic Thoughts. So appreciate that. Tim Wow there. Hello there, Tim Wow. Appreciate you dropping by. Always great to have individuals drop in so that we can discuss things, get some different insight, really dialogue, share info, some of it new info. There are a number of individuals who always drop these special nuggets in the comments that inform myself amongst the rest of the public. So that's always a great thing. So Tim Wow says, James J. Jeffries, one of my favorites. Certainly, he is one of those fan favorites in some sense who has essentially stood the test of time. He's a very unique fighter, considering he was 19-1, and he had 2 draws, I believe 2 no contests as well that are thrown in the mix there. So let me see. Yeah, that is the case. And with that, as I was alluding to, there was a lot that he did within that amount of fights. So you think about a career with 24 fights. Essentially, that's one of those that is more common amongst what we see here today, I would say, because a lot of the individuals fight at more of a sporadic pace at this particular time or day and age, just as far as in between fights. Now, in the case of Jeffries, of course, he was doing this back then, so just unique circumstances surrounding such. But as they say, it's often about what you do within that period and time frame for which you're fighting. So you don't necessarily have to have a huge or large number of fights. In having a large number of fights doesn't always necessarily mean that you were the top of the food chain within your division or within your era. So it's about what you do in those fights. When you start to look at the variety, start to look at the opponents, the resume, you start to dive into how these victories came about, and if an individual lost, how those losses came about, who they were against, what were the circumstances surrounding such. When you factor all of that stuff in, you start to get more of a clearer picture where some of the separation of the greats lies and where they start to veer off in varying directions, I would say. So Jim Jeffries is without a doubt one of those individuals. And he, as Tim puts here, says half of his fights were against Hall of Famers. Yeah, that speaks volumes in itself right there. So that goes to show you that quality of what he was able to do in the ring, the quality of the opponents he faced could far outweigh individuals who may have had lengthier careers with more actual fights. And those are the types of things that you factor in with a guy like James J. Jeffries. And I think that amongst all of the heavyweight champions in history, especially thinking about this era and time frame for which he came, he has a uniqueness that stands out in a way that you could just see him being a force, just being a top level opponent, a top level fighter and champion in pretty much any era, because it wasn't a single trait that made him stand out amongst the others. It was just a combination of varying things. He wasn't the elite of the elite as it relates to the technical side of it. But that being said, he knew how to work things for his advantage. He knew what he was capable of, and he was able to successfully garner whatever it is that was needed for him to look good and to be able to carry himself through contests against top level opposition. And I think that says a great deal about his mental makeup, as well as kind of what went into his training and how he was able to do some of the things that he did, being one of these larger, thick, muscular, more burly guys during his time frame. And he's a very interesting character. So we're going to dive into it. Most certainly, I was mentioning, of course, I'm going to actually bring random acoustic thoughts on as well as we discuss the great James J. Jeffries. And certainly we appreciate everyone being in here. And salute to Velez BTW, says, hey, what's up? Representing from Twitch. Dan says, one of mine too, as of last hour. I never read up a lot about them. Awesome hundreds of fights they call exhibition. Many fights weren't documented too. Some reason, certainly that was the case with the likes of a Jeffries. But yeah, he was pretty well traveled, even beyond those official fights, per se. But as I alluded to, of course, random acoustic thoughts has drop by to share some insight, share his thoughts on the great James J. Jeffries as well, which will be a good thing as we just kind of dive into the career of this great former world heavyweight champion. So, how are you doing, Random?
Big up, 86. I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me on, brother.
Anytime at all. I just realized also I had my I didn't have my mic unmuted, so I was using the built-in mic on the speaker, but I'm good to go now. So, but yeah, appreciate you dropping by, Random. As mentioned, and the sound should be a little bit better now. But as mentioned, talking about James J. Jeffries, just one of those great fighters with a unique style that was built for him to be able to essentially dominate in a number of cases during his time. And I think if you factor in some of his greatest attributes, that being him in his ability to use his size, strength, and endurance to his advantage in an age where you were fighting in some pretty stark conditions by comparison today, where you were fighting out in the heat 25, 45 rounds, just a number of situations of that caliber as a boxer. And then you factor in his size and how he was able to essentially put himself in a position to where even if he lost some of the earlier rounds, even if it were situations where he may have given up some things on the boxing end, he would always seem to find that spark to be able to hold on and get guys out of there in the latter portion of fights or as they started to wear down. It's like his training and the mentality behind how he operated seemed to kick in, and he was able to, of course, withstand, find that mental fortitude, find that extra something that was needed to push a fighter through. So certainly one of the strong fighters from both a physical and mental standpoint. Are there any things related to Jeffries that stand out to you, Random?
Yeah, well, I think, this is a time when it's complicated. The title politics, racial politics, it's very complicated right now at the time he's operating. But to his credit, Jeffries wasn't someone who refused to fight across racial lines. Now, when he got the title, that might have been different. But as far as just as a competitor, cutting his teeth on like the top guys for me, there's either whatever they look like. He was down for that, and later the title and the money politics and stuff kicked in. But you can't say he ducked. You can't say of him to the degree of other people that he ducked fighting across racial lines. And this was at a time when a lot of the great boxers were certainly a healthy proportion of the great boxers were, colored fighters. So he did go in there. The win over Hank Griffin was very good. Hank Griffin's a fighter whose full record is not known, who claimed to have hundreds of fights. So this was a guy, if you look at his record, he has a good, respectable record, but that may not actually even tell the full story of how much that dude was fighting. Fought him, fought Peter Jackson. It's just, sometimes the short career, like personally, I don't have him right at the top of the all-time great heavyweights because the resume could have been larger, even though it was epic. But that's true of some of the great fighters of more recent decades. You can have a powerful career that isn't very numerically potent, and you should get your respect for that, especially if you're fighting some really high level fights. And in this era, he was just able to use his sort of bullish frame and then tailor his style to like he could withstand punishment. So right away, just like with some of these power punching guys, right away you have a great tool. If you can take a lot, there are other boxers I'm sure you can think of, Josh, throughout history, heavyweights who can really take it. So right away, it makes him a tougher proposition than just being skilled or just being this or that. If a guy's a real tank, and he was, if you couldn't hurt him and he sort of realized that in a fight, you're getting bulldozed. And Jeffries, I'd read, I haven't confirmed it, I haven't researched this. It's a little before my area of study, but I read that like he was he wasn't necessarily he was a huge star, but he wasn't necessarily as charismatic as some of the other heavyweight champions, and so there was more pressure on him to actually fight to make money. But I do see on Cyber Boxing Zone that he had a whole slew of exhibitions at times. So he was obviously an attraction or part of the attraction. And he was a giant
Certainly.
star. I mean, the newspapers, they just call him Jeff. They don't even bother with the full name or the acronym or nothing. He's just Jeff. So, and this is even after the fact, even after his title reign, just he was like Cher, he was like Jeff. That's him. He's that guy. But
Oh yeah.
yeah, very famous, very powerful. When he left, he was considered so good. Like when he left the sport, that those years, there's a lot of question about what was going to happen to the heavyweight landscape. And it really, from what I've seen in the papers, it was, I saw heading into at the end of 1907 season, a writer was saying, well, finally, it looks like in 1908, we're going to have just one heavyweight champion. Because you had the colored title claim, you had Jeffries who retired, but then you had, Root and Hart fight for the thing, and Tommy Burns takes it from Hart, and then he's traveling around fighting as much as he can at heavyweight to try and legitimize that title. But he hadn't fought Jack Johnson yet, who'd held the colored title since '03. So I get from the papers a sense of Jeffries, that the vacuum was felt when he left. But
Certainly.
and that's partly what made like Burns and Johnson so big. And then later, a couple years later, the Jeffries Johnson super fight so enormous, even though he'd been gone for seasons and he got really big. He didn't even really look the same. He looked like his own dad, like his face got fat and everything, but it was big because of what it symbolized, that lineage, the lineal champion. So I know there's some stuff where people debate whether or not Tyson Fury should be considered the lineal champion because he left the sport for several seasons. Well, that debate isn't new. That was the case with Jeffries. But then with Jeffries Johnson, the big 1910 super fight, I mean, there was such a heavy racial dynamic because of everything was going on in society at that time. But it didn't matter that he'd been out. It was huge. And, it wasn't like today where you'd see a lot of HD footage of the guy not looking the part. A lot of times in the papers, you don't even get a photo. You just get the write-up or it's like stock
Yeah.
photo. So, yeah, I think people had like overly high hopes for Jeffries. But at his best, he was a beast. He really was. Like at his very
Yeah.
best, at his most dangerous, I don't know how a fight with Johnson would have gone with like 1907, 1908 Johnson, before Johnson got deep into his 30s, when he was still young, would be a great fight. Do you have any? We might even have to do that one, right? Right, Josh? In our Prime versus
Yeah.
Prime series.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. I think that is a very interesting one. I remember us discussing it in some capacity. I don't know if it was on one of those shows specifically, but it is a topic that has most certainly come up. And yeah, probably diving a bit deeper into the detail would shed light on a number of interesting things. So I'm definitely looking forward to doing that at some point. Real quick, I wanted to say shout out to the Boz who is here in the building. You can check me and Boz out typically on Sundays, 2 p.m. time frame, even though we didn't go live this Sunday. Long night the prior night. Essentially, it's called Boxing Shit. We're discussing a lot of the modern stuff that is happening right here and right now in the sport of boxing. So, salute to you there, Boz. Appreciate you dropping in. Shout out to my mom who actually dropped in as well, showing some love. Getting her knowledge up on the boxing history, being a steward of such. So we appreciate you dropping by as well there, Bomb. And the bot said I had Mix Armstrong up with Bob Montgomery. Okay, I got you there. So you made some good points there, Randall, just thinking about James J. Jeffries and when he was fighting the void that was essentially left. He was one of those individuals who I think the true person or his true character, maybe personality, was what you saw in terms of the individual who was retired out on his alfalfa farm. That's what they always shared, that is an alfalfa farm. So he liked to be to his own, one of those guys who wasn't necessarily one of those spotlight craving fighters. He just treated it in a blue collar manner as far as how he went about his trade, went out there, did the work that he needed to do, and he would move on to that next thing. He was one of those individuals who, he had a character. One of the funny things is I'm thinking about James J. Jeffries, and I was alluding to the fighter Joe Grimm, who we have a video on the channel, who was this fighter who could absorb this unhuman like amount of punishment, and it became sort of a sideshow, almost barbaric act at times during his career. And he fought out of Philadelphia. They would just match him up with individuals, seeing if someone could knock him out. And I recall that, you had guys like Fitzsimmons, Joe Gans, you had Jack Blackburn, you had just a number of fighters who actually went up against Joe Grimm, and they weren't able to knock him out. And I know one of the big things that they were pushing for, the promoters, they were pushing for James Jeffries to give hit or to fight this Joe Grimm guy, who really was it was about 150 pounds, somewhere in there. And I know that James Jeffries, he actually refused to do so because he felt that it wasn't proper and it was more of a sideshow type act. So he was a guy who had character to him. And some alluded in the chat, of course, I saw the name Bob Armstrong coming up. And as you mentioned, uh, our random, he did take on a number of different black fighters, but Bob Armstrong, one of those individuals he worked with on numerous occasions, and there was almost a bit of tutelage there in terms of them coming up essentially in around the same time, and that you had to think played benefit or paid dividends for individuals like Bob Armstrong, because like Armstrong and some of the other heavyweights from that particular period who were able to stand out, they often had to start tough early. And that meant that you didn't necessarily get those easy clashes or those easy breaks in your career. And for Jeffries, this was the case. He's one of those guys who started tough early, like the likes of Armstrong, Denver Ed Martin, Jack Johnson, etc., there in his career. And as you alluded to, he started there in the early 19 or 1890s, and or more around the mid 1890s. But Hank Griffin, it's not credited on Cyber Boxing or on BoxRec, but Cyber Boxing Zone has it. Hank Griffin was one of those individuals he first went up against, who was a guy who was about 6 feet tall, very solid, strong fighter, tough fighter. He was sound enough fundamentally to be a legitimate contender during his fighting era during that particular time. And it was individuals like this who were some of these heavyweights who, when you think about the great heavyweights in history and how the lineage of the title has moved along, these are guys who often their names won't be mentioned, but they played instrumental roles for a number of the individuals who ended up becoming champion during that period. So this includes Jeffries, this includes Jack Johnson, so on and so forth. So that's the type of competition and the depth at which Jeffries had to kind of jump out there just from the very start of his resume. And you'd have to think that that kind of put him in a good spot and poised him to be able to handle the major moments, handle the major opponents as they continue to get better and as the stakes continue to get higher. So I thought that was something certainly worth noting there. And thinking about him from a stylistic standpoint, read him. I know it's noted that he wasn't necessarily the most skilled of fighters when we think about the pure fundamentals, but what he did to counteract that, a lot of that went into the training that he actually participated in sort of grueling training regimes and training regimens, and this allowed him to build up that strength, build up that mental fortitude, as mentioned, to be able to step in there, and even at his size, he could outwork guys who were much smaller when you just think about it overall. And I think that kind of speaks volumes as well. The fact that you had this guy who was a pretty solid and massive heavyweight for his time, but the conditioning aspect of it was one of his strong suits. And I think that helped to pay dividends. Any thoughts surrounding that?
Yeah, I mean, the guy was a bull. And you see a picture of him when he's young, not when he's older and he hasn't fought for years and he doesn't have the exhibition schedule he once had. So, like, folks, go to Cyber Boxing Zone or Josh City if you want to pull it up. You know, if you look at his exhibition schedule, it's like 1897. You know, has like a couple, looks like a dozen and a half or more, you know, exhibitions with Jim Corbett. But like later on, 1899 is a busy thing. He's doing exhibitions with guys like Jim Daly. He's doing them with his brother Jack Jeffries. Exhibitions with Tommy Ryan. There were some other scheduled ones that didn't happen, but like he's involved a great deal with the craft. He may not be the kind of like smooth talker or suave character who could, you know, it's like, okay, you see in Jack Dempsey, you see a guy who fights like the devil, but he puts on a suit. He looks absolutely phenomenal and he's like very debonair. Jeffries maybe didn't have that, but as far as just being a tough guy who can fight, who can really fight and keep busy and take punishment, like stuff bounce off him. Yeah, he's that dude. Yeah, see, look at that. So, you know, if you go to BoxRec, it's a great site. It has its problems, as does every site, but overall, BoxRec's very useful in combination with others. But it won't show you really how busy Jeffries was within the craft. And exhibitions, Fitzsimmons, some of these other popular, especially heavyweights of the early era, they could make money giving exhibitions. They could sell tickets to exhibitions. Like you said, they could do challenge matches, you know, to try and stay 4 rounds. I'm trying to remember who it was. I think might have been Jack Monroe. I think he was a coal miner who actually knocked Jeffries down in an exhibition. I think I saw that in a newspaper report. Maybe it was from 99, from a recap of 1899, but they fought later. I think they fought later on. They actually had an actual fight. But so Jeffries, there is some question as to what was an official fight and what wasn't, because I imagine they were selling tickets to all of this mess. So they're making that money either way, you know. So as a heavyweight champ, you are a spectacle. And there's not, you know, it's not like a video-rich era. So you want to see the champ when he comes into town, you go buy your ticket and go see the champ. And, so he was able to earn money, and this would help explain why once Jack Johnson defeated Tommy Burns in 1908, why he didn't immediately jump into this crazy schedule fighting all these great contemporaries who were at heavyweight with him. Man, there was a lot of money to be made. I'm pretty sure he did like music hall appearances in Australia, then he went back to America. He's doing, you know, there's more money to be made. You're definitely a key business when you're the heavyweight champ. And so Jeffries his career shows that. But he could fight. He fought guys who would have beaten him up if he couldn't fight. Just being big isn't enough. So he could fight, but he wasn't a non-paral Jack Dempsey. You know, the first Jack Dempsey, the brilliant stylist. He wasn't a Joe Gans. He wasn't considered Georgie Dixon or these guys, or even like a Troyansky. But if you're enormous and you can really crack and you can take it and dish it out, well, it is a fight sport. So you don't have to have finesse if you can win the other way without like extreme finesse. If you have enough to deliver your power, hey, that's good enough. And when he was at his best, he was pretty scary. He was a scary guy, you know, and even with certain fighters he wouldn't face, or it just looked like they couldn't make the fight once he was the champion. That doesn't, just like with Johnson and his contemporaries during his unified title reign, doesn't mean that people thought the other guys would definitely beat him. They just wanted to see the fight. Jeffries was like that. He was the top guy. But there were maybe questions because he didn't fight as, you know, a lot of exhibitions. He didn't have as many official fights as other guys. But, you know, I guess we see that today. There are questions about who the actual best is because we're trying to get all the best guys to go ahead and fight each other before they're too old. You know, we have these little detours. Like, I don't think it's an exhibition, but Fury's going to make an absolute pile of money, just a mountain of cash to fight. The guy's still widely acknowledged as a top mixed rules fighter in the world, in an open weight sense, Francis Ngannou. So, Obviously Usyk, we wanted to fight the best guy. Can we just figure out who the actual best guy who's collectively beaten all the guys? Can we have him face off? But money talks, man. Jeffries, his career too, those exhibitions, the ratio of danger to his title and danger to his physical being and money, that worked in his favor. And that's why you see that schedule. That's also why you see the guys today not fighting as much, because it's easier to build a brand. So more guys can cash in like this. So social media, appearances, and then really twist the knife when it's time for negotiations. And that's why Fury's going to make tens of millions of dollars to fight a guy who has some kickboxing experience. I don't know if Ngannou has ever competed in a sanctioned boxing match. I should probably look that up.
Yeah, I don't think
it's a freak show fight. So I actually like freaky fights. They're fun. But I don't necessarily research freak show fights. I'm just looking forward to hopefully chaos. I'm hoping Fury gets knocked down just because I love chaos. It's very, very unlikely, but I love chaos. What can I say?
Yeah. Hey, that would definitely shake up some things. I'm here for it. I'm all here for it. That's the route Fury chose to win, so I'm here for it in totality. Real quick, salute again to some of the individuals that dropped in. We've got a lot of comments that have come in. Poland Ball, salute to you, Poland Ball 69 dropped by saying Jeffries is one of the most underrated heavies ever. Most certainly. He did a lot in this short career of his, and I think that kind of just adds to the mystique of Jeffries. But some other comments that were mentioned up there, I know that Rodolfo mentioned that the longest lineal champion has been active was 3 years, 3 months by Jess Willard. Yeah, that's pretty far out. Just thinking about it, Willard, yeah, another one of those guys. Once he got the title, took advantage of the money and financials that came along with it, or just overall financial gains that came along with it. As we were showing here on Cyber Boxing Zones, their schedule, they actually include the exhibition. So you see him, these guys were very familiar with each other as far as Jeffries, Jim Corbett. You'll see he was familiar with Bob Armstrong. Hank Griffin was another one that was mentioned, but it was just one of those things. So even though Jeffries didn't have a huge career as far as the total numbers in official fights, he spent a great deal of time just competing in the sport. And it was really just commonplace at that particular point. You can just kind of go back and look at the heavyweights prior to him, especially John L. Sullivan, who was the most popular during the mid to late 1800s. And even he did a great deal of touring across the country and hosting these exhibitions, doing plays, things of that nature, because he helped to elevate the heavyweight title to a status that made people just want to see the champion regardless of the situation. And therefore, you didn't necessarily see a ton of actual title defenses in an official capacity like you would expect to see. And you could have those lengthy type of droughts where a guy wasn't necessarily fighting and defending his title in the same manner, or at least with that same type of pace that this same fighter had fought prior to actually picking up the title. And as you know, the financial side of it makes a huge difference with such. So it was just a common thing there for Jeffries. And Jeffries, yeah, he's one of these guys that, despite, like we were alluding to, not necessarily a huge personality, he was one of these individuals who was pretty a standout guy, or stand-up guy, a high character guy in some sense. And he was one of these individuals who was willing to step out there, step outside of the shadows when he needed to, and put on a great show for the fans. And of course, we speak about at varying times, just like what would have happened with Jeffries had he fought Johnson in a different time frame. I know that's another one of those fantasy fights that is always brought up. I think it offers a lot of intrigue. And Jeffries, if you just look at how he started his career, he was thrown in the mix with tough fighters from the beginning. So you could argue that just from a developmental standpoint, he developed a little further just because he was involved with a number of these top level, more obscure these days heavyweights who are, excuse me, working with him not only behind the scenes, but when he was doing these types of exhibitions, things of that nature. So, him 5 fights into Jeffries' career is different than being 5 fights into the career of another person or another fighter from that period. And Dan also alluded to the likes of working with guys like Tommy Ryan, who was one of the great boxers in the history of the sport and who was world welterweight and middleweight champion. So these are the types of individuals that Jeffries had in his corner, being able to work with the likes of Orion and him as a heavyweight, this being Jeffries, being able to use that knowledge, use that experience to his advantage. Also, the likes of Joe Chewinski, which is a name you see there as well. And we always bring up the fact that Joe Chewinski, one of those underrated fighters who was a light heavyweight, I guess you can say middleweight, and kind of starting in that range, but he was one of those individuals who fought up to heavyweight, known to be a very skilled boxer during his time. And he was a guy, of course, who knocked out Jack Johnson. So he had a good deal of pop. A lot of that set up by just his overall skill set and advantage. And Joe Chewinski, the only video we do have of him in action, and it's not in an official fight, but we have him actually training, working with James J. Jeffries for that 1910 matchup with Jack Johnson when he came out of retirement. And as you can see here, 1899, they were already familiar with each other. They had already been in the ring with each other. You see other guys' names like Gus Rulin, who was another guy who was highly touted during that period, who Jeffries had on the resume very early on. And these are the types of things that helped to build him up to what he ultimately became. So I think that is something that is most certainly worth noting. And you just think about what separates these guys and why guys are held in such high regards. One of the things you can dive into is just their resume and see how tough they were fighting early on and how often, even if it were at a less than sort of expedient pace, just the work that you were putting in during that time frame, I think is some good stuff. So Poland Ball says Jeffrey's punching power is very hard to determine considering he often outsides his best opponents by over 30 pounds. However, he is the only champion to knock out all of his opponents down in his defensive. Great point there. So what do you think? Random in terms of translating his power as far as James J. Jeffries, who is one of those individuals, as we mentioned, was very keen on the endurance side. He was strong. He was a big guy, and he could outmuscle his opponents. But his punching power or his ability to punch would be different than, say, the likes of a Sam Blankford, who was smaller, just from an overall perspective, but carried the type of punch that looked a bit different when he was in the ring with guys, especially even guys that were bigger than him. So what are your thoughts on that, kind of just how that translates with him being the guy that he was, and in his strong suit more so being the attrition side of it, though he can most certainly pack enough of a punch to get individuals out of there early.
Yeah, it's like some other big bull type, like power punching guys. It takes, if you have all the physical advantages, it takes less in a sport, in a combat sport. If you have all the physical advantages, or most of them, then it takes less skill to be better than someone. Someone has to have disproportionate skill to overcome those advantages. In kickboxing, the great Ernesto Hoost, arguably the greatest of the golden age heavyweight kickboxers, certainly one of them, but arguably the greatest. He lost to Bob Sapp, who had like 90 pounds on him or something, and wasn't good and kind of flailed, but he had 90 pounds of muscle on him, full of the rocket fuel. And he actually beat him in the ring, which was a huge thing at the time. But then he also later lost to the great Mirko Cro Cop, I think he got his jaw broken in that one. He got low kicked and then punched in the jaw, and Sapp went down. And then later, Sapp became kind of a meme. People like, he's not trying, he's just paychecking it. But when he came into the sport, he was this bull, and he was so huge. He was so much bigger than everyone else and stronger. And he wasn't fighting in like a heavily regulated performance-enhancing drug setting, we'll just say. So he was, but he was basically able to use his size to overcome more skilled fighters, even great finishers like Ernesto Hoost. So I think with Jeffries, it's important to yes, he wasn't the most skilled, but he had skill. And if you look at his exhibition schedule, he was getting that work in. And to be fair to the as fewer fights he did fight in a time when it was hard to get regulated. So you had up on the screen, he was matched to fight Sharkey, and they wouldn't issue a license. Earlier on, you scroll past, he was scheduled another fight with Gus Rulin, and the governor of Ohio or something squashed it. He had a fight with Kid McCoy scheduled, the great Kid McCoy, but they couldn't come to terms. So there are reasons. This happened with Fitzsimmons as well when he was the champ. If people couldn't meet his purse, he would shop it to a different athletic club. So it's I saw someone, he was like, well, it's got to be X, or so he's basically taking bids from all these different athletic clubs / promoters to see who will host the thing. And that's partly why you end up seeing certain great boxers staying around a place. Like Sam Langford had a bunch of fights from 11 to the end of 11 through 13 in Australia. He made some appearances, did some sparring. Jeffries, he was busy. He was really busy. If you look, his week to week schedule some of those years is oh dude, he's getting his work in. So he's actually building his brand. And this was how you built your brand in those days. Exhibitions, you go around, you're becoming more notable. You do exhibitions with famous fighters, up and coming fighters, famous tough guys from other regions of the country. So he plants himself in some Nevada town for weeks, and he's doing all this stuff. The man is getting paid. So the business always comes first. That's why Fury is fighting. He's doing a Mayweather-McGregor kind of, except it's heavyweight, so it's a little more dangerous than McGregor. McGregor had no chance against Floyd. I mean, most boxing fans understood that it was kind of a joke fight. The MMA fans told themselves whatever they want. But at heavyweight, it's a little different. You can really crack, just like Jack Monroe who wasn't on Jeffries' level, knocked him down in an exhibition. The papers made a big deal of that. I think that might have actually been 1902. I feel like I saw it while I was researching what was happening heading into the 1903 season. So it's you can have upsets. You could see Fury almost lose to a prospect. If a normal fighter, they would have stopped it on cuts. The upsets happen. So with this exhibition schedule, there is some risk involved. You can get bad press if you don't look good. And someone can also come up if they do look good in the exhibition. And so, it was worth it. There's a reason it was like that. And it's totally fair to not count that toward the resume, the exhibitions, but the awareness of what he was doing. He wasn't just sitting around. He wasn't sitting by the pool. The guy was out here doing work, but it was a different kind of work. And, he wasn't the first. He definitely wasn't the last. So just to put in perspective what's happening, because I know some of the boxing purists might resent that Fury is wasting a fight at the end of his prime or early past prime, whatever he is now, against Ngannou, but it's business. And hopefully some of the people who are attracted to Freak Show will stay and pay attention to the rest of the sport. And that's how these things work. That's how it worked back in Jeffries' day. Some portion of the people who go to see the Freak, look at the big scary guys. Actually, I really like this. This resonates with me. So, it's all building the business as well as the competition. But I don't rate Jeffries as high as I would if he had a tougher official fight schedule. So I do think exhibitions are different, even if they're really trying. It's different, shorter rounds. But he was powerful. He was a danger, and people knew it at the time. It wasn't like he wasn't some fake thing. Lots of people had seen him in person. He'd had tough fights. He'd shown he could get it on with everyone. So when he took the championship, and actually interestingly, Sam Langford, the gentleman I researched, he barred Jeffries. He had a challenge to anyone except Jeffries. And I think it was because he was in awe of Jeffries for beating his hero, Bob Fitzsimmons. or it was just PR. He was just doing public relations, because Sam was pretty easygoing. So he was saying, no one can beat Jeffries, so I'm
Yeah.
not going to try because no one can, because he's the best, and yeah, Jeffries was a real unit. He was definitely at his very best. It would have been interesting if he'd had more fights at his very
Yeah.
best, but a lot of people in his day did get to see him at exhibition,
Yeah.
hundreds of exhibitions. So lots of people, lots of crowds got to come see this guy at a time when it was hard to see your favorites if you're just some person. You know, you have
Yeah.
to live in one of the key spots. So, they built the sport brick by brick, fan by fan, and like
Hmm.
so even times when it's frustrating, the competition level in official fights, things are still happening structurally for the sport. The freaky stuff, or the stuff that hits, like, taps into some nerve, some sort of like mood, the moment, that just grows the overall fan base bit by bit, because there's an attrition rate, because at the same time a lot of people are burning out because of bad decisions, or they lose too much money betting or whatever. We got to replace those people, and those casuals turn into some small portion of the freak show observers become casuals, and a few of them become hardcores. And we just got to
Hmm.
keep replenishing the thing. Weird stuff is good in fight sports, as long as it doesn't become the main point. So Jeffries had some tough fights. Credit to him. He was a pretty powerful champion. He definitely represented the sport reasonably well, although there was like color line politics, obviously, once he had the championship. But leading up to that, he wasn't a guy who ducked anybody. Like, he went in there and had some fights. So I think, things changed a little bit. He didn't want Johnson's challenge, but I don't know who would have won that fight. Like a younger Johnson, after he'd, beaten Denver Martin. He's the co-champ. He
Yeah.
wants to fight. I'm not sure, because I'm not sure where Jeffries was by a couple years into the 1900s. I'm not sure when he actually peaked. That's probably something you know better than I do. But
Yeah. He was. That certainly would have been a tough fight for Johnson. I think. Personally, Johnson prior to 1904, or at least certainly 1903 time frame, he would have had a better chance during that time frame. But anything prior to that, I think that Jeffries would have likely defeated him, just because he was a more experienced and, I guess you can say, polished fighter. He had kind of already started to mature into who he was as a fighter, mature into his body, his fighting style, and all of that. So it's certainly one of those factors, and that's what makes the discussion and the potential of the two having faced with both in their prime, both of them being at their younger peak. That's what makes the thought of that actually happening very interesting. So salute to Blake Gallimore, who dropped by. I appreciate you dropping in here, Blake. As always, real quick, just going to get to some of these comments. A lot of good discussion that has taken place. Poland Ball mentions Ruling, Kennedy, Monroe are all over 200 pounds, so it's not like Jeff never fought big fighters. Certainly, that is the case there. And Gus Ruling, we actually have that contest on video. It's one that you can go check out there, folks, and you'll get to see how he matches up size-wise. But he was a legitimate challenger to Jeffries in their contest, as far as some of the fan backing, the fanfare behind it. So people were looking forward to it because Rulin was a standout. I'm actually working on a video. He's a key piece of this particular fighter that I'm working on. And they kind of came to, and we're really just kind of shooting up the ranks together. And it'll be interesting. So I look forward to it. Poland Ball mentions Hank Griffin, Bob Armstrong, Peter Jackson. Yeah, other great names that are on the resume that Jeffrey stepped in with. Of course, Hank Griffin, that was in the midst of the title reign as well. He fought Hank Griffin in a solid, a solid showing for Griffin, solid fight. But Jeffries, he was just a formidable guy. And then, of course, Bob Armstrong, he's another one of those individuals. Learned a lot on the job, learned a lot in the background. They're sparring, working with fighters like Jeffries, and he is a colored world heavyweight champion. And a lot of that was Drew gaining that experience and being in there. Then we know the great Black Prince Peter Jackson. He was Jeffries' opponent in Jackson's second to last fight. He was man, such a formidable force in his time when he was at his peak. Peter Jackson, that is just an absolute treasure of a boxer. But he did step in there past it in not necessarily at his best with Jeffries. So that goes to show you those guys weren't afraid to mix it up, regardless of what stage they were at in their careers. And thank you, Rodolfo, dropping that lineal title knowledge that I've seen those as well popping up there, Rodolfo. Alexander says Jeffries didn't KO all of his defensive. Sharkey went 25 rounds in the title defense for a points loss. Certainly. So, yeah, Jack Sharkey is one of those guys that he did go the distance with. And as a matter of fact, we do have a little footage. We spoke about it before. We did a discussion on Tom Sharkey, rather, that kind of highlights that actual video. Is really the only video that is out there of him in one of those contests with Jeffries, which was shot in a very grainy way. The lights had gone out, I believe, at the actual theater, or at least it got too hot, and they couldn't get the regular video footage that was being taken or was being filmed. And therefore, we only have a small clip of it. But Sharkey, one of the big punchers during his period. Salute to Dan L in the building as well. Appreciate you here, Dan L. Definitely enjoy you dropping by, sharing your thoughts. The other Dan mentioned destroyed Corbett, Fitzsimmons twice, Sharkey twice, Hank Griffin, Peter Jackson is second, and Fitz KO to do 45 seconds for a record. So yeah, he did beat those guys, but as alluded to by Dan L here, he far from destroyed Corbett. He finally caught him in the 23rd, 25th of a 25-round fight. Had it gone the distance, it is generally believed Corbett would have gotten the decision. Yes, that's how I recall it as well there. Dan L, it was one of those situations, even in those contests with Bob Fitzsimmons. You know, we talked about Jeffries, at least from a fundamental standpoint. There were boxers out there that were better fundamentally, who were fighting in the heavyweight division. And, of course, Corbett and Fitzsimmons were two of those guys. So they had some pretty solid success against Jeffries outside of them, of course, being stopped. Now, see, that's what's the standout of the tough part about it. It's, can you withstand the heat that is coming? And that proves to be tough to deal with a guy like Jeffries, because he could take a lot of punishment, but he could also be there and still be sharp in game in the latter portions of fights when some of his opponents, especially those who couldn't get to him and actually get him out of there, which we know that was not an easy thing to do, he would still make sure that he's around. And that bodes back, or doesn't bode too well for a smaller opponent or someone who doesn't have the size to deal with him just on that level deep into fights, which is pretty remarkable in itself, because, as always mentioned, he was a pretty sizable guy. He was a muscular guy. So we generally think of those guys, and one of the things that we don't necessarily associate with them as far as their strong suit in the sport is their conditioning and endurance. It's always a question of how these big guys, or how will they be able to deal with things in the latter portion of fights. But James J. Jeffries, he seemed to have the formula, because that's where he continued to be at his best. It's just when the fight kept going, being able to go through and deal with that attrition that came about. So I definitely think that that's what allowed him to stand out, and why he deserves props as far as what he was able to do in the sport. Real quick,
Yeah, for
also.
real. Hey Josh, I gotta head into work in a sec. Can I just add one thing to what you said?
Yeah. Feel free.
See, at his best, in a pre-steroids era, he was naturally over 200 pounds. So like in a fantasy fight with some of these other guys, before the era where you could have a little pharmaceutical assistance, a little hormonal love boosting, he was natural. He was a brick shithouse. Like this guy was a tank, and and wouldn't be considered like a slight frame today. if everyone today was forced to never touch an enhancer or never, like different ways people at different times in their lives, they get put on a bunch of muscle. He was the real thing, a real unit. And that did factor in uh, being naturally larger than a lot of his opponents, and naturally larger. I emphasize that because, they're fighting an era with smaller gloves, no mouthpiece, no steroids. So these long fights, these long grueling fights, these are dangerous things. This is a very unsafe time, unsafe sport. And so yeah, these early guys, like, who knows what they do in the larger gloves with the mouthpiece, and everything's like much more regulated. There's less dirty moves that, because it's harder to get away on camera, get away with these things, less butting and stuff like that, thumb gouging, all the different things that certain fighters would employ over the years. So yeah, he deserves a great amount of credit. I can't thank you enough for having me on, man. I don't even have a lot to say about Jeffries other than just my regular babble, but man, it's a lot of fun. I appreciate you having me. I'm going to listen to the rest while I do my thing at work. Slinging pallets.
Good to go. Hey, appreciate you dropping by, Random, as always. And folks,
Thanks,
be
brother.
sure to check him out. Give him a like and subscribe. There's some discussions over on his channel where we're actually diving into more of the history talk, to include individuals like Langford and some of the other great heavyweights, certainly with a lot of emphasis on the great heavyweights of this same early era. So salute to you, Random Acoustic Thoughts. Thanks for dropping by once again, buddy. Alexander Campbell. Jeffries pretty much dominated the division totally. Most certainly. Most certainly he did. Salute to the Bronze Boy Jay. That Bronze Boy Jay. Appreciate you dropping by, my man. As always, it's always great to dialogue, have discussions with you for sure. So thanks for dropping by. But yeah, Detroit was far from the case. Never said Jeffries was lucky. Yeah. So yeah, Jeffries, hey, he was able to get those guys out of there in the latter portions of fights, and that was where he had some strong suits for sure. Poland Ball mentions Jeffries fought Sharku and one arm that second time. Yeah, there were some issues going into that, right? Something of that nature. I don't remember the full details or the degree of which. But that being said, certainly, man, Jeffries just a handful to deal with. So, in kind of jumping back into Jeffries himself, of course, he's from Ohio. You think about that, an Ohio champion. Ohio has produced some pretty solid fighters over the course of boxing history as well. You just think about some of your favorites, or some of other individuals' favorites. The Cincinnati Cobra, you know. Think about Ezra Charles. You think about guys like Aaron Pryor. Ohio, tough guys. Even just guys over the years. Ray Boom Boom Mancini from Youngstown, Ohio. More recent times, Kelly Pavlik, he had a run there, became middleweight champion out of Youngstown, Ohio as well. So Jeffries, he's from Ohio. And he was born in 1875, April 1875 in Carroll, Ohio. So is he Ohio's greatest champion? An argument probably can be made there. That'll be an interesting one to look into, Ohio's greatest champion. You know, we'll talk about those states and how some states have produced a lot of top level, top caliber champions and fighters over the course of the years. So Ohio, is Jeffries the top Ohio boxers? I know I didn't name everyone, but Ohio, that's a deep one. You know, they have a lot of competition that has come out of there. So very interesting stuff. Tim Wow says, I was going to bring anything with Jeff. Then it says Sam didn't want anything with Jeff. If Marvin Hart beat Jack in 1905, Jeffries would have destroyed him that year. That's an interesting one because in that fight, when you read the reports as far as Jack Johnson versus Marvin Hart, it was mentioned that Hart was doing the leading, but that didn't necessarily mean he was winning the actual contest. Johnson took a more defensive posture throughout that fight. So I think that kind of factored into it, and it went to the referee's decision who gave it to Hart. But just reading the accounts from that time, or at least some of them, I'm sure there are varying ones, it seems to be the case that while Hart did get that victory, it wasn't a clear-cut victory in that sense. And that's just from what I've gathered. And then as Ball mentioned, of course, Sam didn't want to fight Jeffries when Jeffries was active. Sam was only a welterweight. Yeah, certainly Sam would have been far outsized at that point. And, it took a while for Sam to actually get to that full-fledged heavyweight body of his. And even with that, of course, he wasn't a very large heavyweight, especially when you think about it from a weight perspective. So a guy like Jeffries at that time, yeah, that would have been tough for Sam Langford, even just given the overall size. And that was one of the issues that Langford ran into. He fought Johnson during that period, or at least early on in his career. And a similar situation. The size of Johnson was really a factor because he outweighed Langford. Same with Sam McVeigh, had like 41 pounds on him when they, I believe, first fought. So Langford was still in there and would do it. But that being said, certainly to deal with that size overall, that is something to deal with. Yeah. Corbett, a great fighter. Oh yeah. He was. It was. I mentioned in there. Did Alexander Cameron Jeffries had true one punch knockout power. He had the muscle of a weightlifter. Naturally a 215, 25 pounder. Yeah. He was a very solid dude, as mentioned. Yeah, if you actually go look at it, look at his record, and on BoxRec they'll share some of those weights that they've recorded. They picked up from some of the uh, clippings and some of the actual accounts for the time. And you'll see that Jeffries, he was routinely over 200 pounds, so he was most certainly a full-fledged heavyweight, and that was going to be a full-fledged heavyweight you were going to be dealing with for the duration of a fight. And that's the key part, something that sticks out, that duration. The duration of a fight is and just being able to withstand, stay in there, and it's hard to keep up that same level and pace that you start out with. There are some rare guys who are considered to be individuals, Harry Greb being one of them, who just fought at a rapid pace throughout a contest. But more oftentimes than not, yeah, I mean, that fatigue starts to kick in. And that second gear for Jeffries, hey, that was a natural thing. Pulling Ball says it wasn't luck at all against Corbett. Corbett was getting tired, and Jeff took over from round 17. Certainly, yeah. Corbett, he was going on Corbett was on a very solid run. He had been taking out guys that were going up against him. He was in there with a number of top level individuals. But that being said, hey, that gravy train had to come to a stop at some point. He fought Peter Jackson, and he mentioned as a champion he would rematch Peter Jackson. That never happened. So I think that would have been a big piece of trouble. He would have been in a world of hurt fighting Peter Jackson again for that title, because Peter Jackson, man, he would have been too tough to deal with, I think, just at that particular time. Too tough to deal with. We think about their post 1890, or around 1892, when Jackson was gunning for that fight with Sullivan. So Darkman says, hello, gentlemen. Salute to you, Darkman. Appreciate you dropping by here, buddy. As always, good to chat with you. It's showing love to everyone in the chat. So Darkman says, is there any prime Jeffries fight footage? So yes, there is some footage out there that I guess you could say is considered to be his prime footage to a certain degree. There's a contest out there with Gus Rulin, who was a top contender at heavyweight during that period. There's some channels out there that have kind of updated that video, I believe, to get it from a frame rate perspective in a better place than the initial copies that I had saw out there on YouTube, Darkman. But yeah, that is one of them that is out there. You have him, a little bit of him in there with Sharkey. This was during his heavyweight title reign. Now it's a very short clip, but there is a little bit of it. So Rulin, Sharkey, there's some other footage of him as well, but of course the one that stands out is the one with Johnson, and yeah, that was not the prime version of him. I believe there's some footage out there of him training as well when he was at his, I guess you could say, peak or in or around there for the most part. But yeah, I can't remember if there are any other fights. As a matter of fact, I think Cyber Boxing Zone may have link some stuff. Boxing Zone, James J. Jeffries. That's a good question, though. There, it's pretty amazing. That's a good question, Darkman. It's pretty amazing, but we do have a good deal of footage of individuals from that period, which I think is certainly a good thing to actually have. And if you really think about that, that's a treat right there because a lot of stuff got lost. So yeah, I think those are the only ones where he's in action outside of course, that Jack Johnson period, which was not him at his best. So not a ton of stuff out there, Dark Man, but a little bit of stuff. And then there's some other ones of him like doing interviews and things of that nature as well. But certainly, man, he's one of those guys who was a standout for his period for sure. Poland Ball says, "Yeah, there's footage." Okay, yeah, so yeah. So good to go there, Poland Ball, as mentioned. So he's a California fighter, Dan. Oh yeah, salute to you. Yeah, California. Yeah, a lot of his fights were taking place out there in California. As a matter of fact, you're correct in that sense. So yeah, San Francisco at that time, pretty much a hotbed, as mentioned. That's the area by which Jim Corbett he came out of there as well. Shout out to that Gentleman Jim movie. It puts it into even more perspective. I was mentioning this in some previous streams since Corbett's name came up. Just actually watched that movie from 1942, and it was very good, very very good. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So Darkman says, "Thank you, Poland. I saw you coming in the grab video. There was more grab film in YouTube that got taken down. If I'm right, what was that?" So okay, yeah, I had heard about that Dark Man, or I think you mentioned that tough to his heavyweight division ever at the time. He destroyed everyone. Certainly, impressive run there from Jeffries just overall. So Poland Ball says it was extra shadow boxing footage with Jack O'Brien, nothing very special apparently. Okay, good to go there, Poland Ball. Yeah, and some others were mentioning that ESPN had purchased Jim Jacobs' catalog of boxing history or whatever, and there may be some footage of Greb out there or something, or locked in a vault at ESPN out there in Connecticut. They're in some part of Connecticut, so that would be interesting if that was the case. I wish we could get some confirmation on that. I wish we can get confirmation on whether that footage is out there. Anyone know anyone at ESPN? Anyone have Max Kellerman's number? Surely Max would have seen this and would have at least shared this information with the world if he knew of a vault being there, or some of these rare fights in historic footage being locked in a vault outside of what we have seen released by them and things of that nature. Surely Max Kellerman would have jumped in the mix and tried to get to something to throw together out there, right? But maybe not. Maybe not. Dan says there's a film of Jeffries displaying his footwork phenomenal. This guy was a freak of nature. Certainly, yeah. You were noting and rolling off some things earlier for sure, Dan, that he was a heck of an athlete. So it wasn't just like he was just only a boxing guy, but he was just naturally athletic, naturally just one of these guys who were big and could do things at his size that the average wouldn't necessarily be able to do on just a regular basis. So that adds to it as well, for sure. Poland Ball says Jeffries was similar to Frazier in terms of being reliant on his left hand. I wonder how a fight between those two would have gone. Very interesting one right there, Poland Ball. Very interesting. Thinking that left hook coming from Frazier, of course, like you said, that mentality, both of them essentially coming forward. And man, it'd be tough. It'd be tough. That left hook from Frazier would certainly be a tough thing to deal with. But of course, you think about the size of Jeffries, and of course, Frazier was a solid guy himself. But you know, Jeffries being taller, and yeah, he could match him pretty much size wise as well. I'd imagine that'd been a lot to deal with. He was very strong as well, Jeffrey. So very interesting there when they're Poland Ball, must admit. Very interesting. The Johnson farce was ridiculous farce. We shouldn't be credit, no more talk. This shit like saying Ali get exposed by Barrett Holmes only a year after. Yeah, that fight was not that certainly was not the legitimate or real deal version of Jeffries. He was kind of doing that. A lot of pressure for someone to take on Jack Johnson to defeat him. So, man, they say pressure bursts pipes. I'm sure deep down he probably didn't want to do it, but man, he was being pressured, being hounded for, and people just wanted him to come out. They wanted him to come out and defeat Johnson. Then he had so many people backing on him, so he acquiesced to come out of retirement. And you have to think that, yeah, probably even himself, just thinking about what all he had to drop weight wise and do to get up to that point. Yeah, I could only wonder what he was thinking in his head, just in general, knowing that this was going to be one of the toughest things a boxer could do. Just period. You're nearly 6 years removed from the ring, and nowhere near your fighting weight, and then you're expected to go in and take on the guy who is the best in your division at that particular time. Yeah, it's like a fool's errand is what I always say. He's kind of just pressured into it, but certainly that's not him. That wasn't the version of him at his best. Salute to Bruce Gas, Boxing, Jazz, and more. Says salute, Josh. Appreciate you, Bruce, as always. Be sure to check out Bruce, folks. Give him a like and subscribe. A lot of great content. A lot of good discussions going on over there on Bruce Gass's channel. Always appreciate being able to chat with Bruce. He's always dropping some nice gems and nuggets for sure. So appreciate you, Bruce. Bruce Gas, Boxing, Jazz, and more, folks. Check him out. Check him out. Danelle, Errol Flynn was a natural athlete and a good amateur boxer. Mushy Callahan trained Flynn, and he had spoken a lot of older men who had seen Corbett. Wow, that's pretty awesome right there. Danelle didn't know about that. Didn't know about Mushy Callahan training him. That's pretty cool. That is pretty cool right there. So yeah, he did a good job in there. I didn't know what to expect going into it, but as I've previously shared, I actually enjoyed that movie, and I thought they did a good job of kind of picking up, or at least that character selection, and picking up on some of those traits and giving us a kind of view of the personality of Corbett, especially tying some things back to the accounts, and then some of the actual fights and the stuff that happened and discussions and things that matched the accounts as well. So it was pretty cool. So I enjoyed it. I wonder if any historian collector has old legendary fight films. Darkman. Well, the guy, Jim Jacobs, as far as I know, he was one who had the largest, at least up until the 80s, late 80s, right? Late 80s, early 90s. I think he died in, was it late 80s? I'm sure someone knows, but as far as I know, Darkman, that was the largest collection, I believe, that anyone had. I don't know that, I don't know that definitively. Like, certainly this is not the gospel, but from what I heard, yeah, he was on a top tier of kind of historian and memorabilia type guy. So he had a ton of footage, and that's supposedly the footage that ESPN purchased. The ESPN, they have done some of those documentaries that we see, like Sports Century stuff as well. So yeah, they may have had pretty much the largest, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't any others out there who may have had some stuff that probably never meet the masses. So very, 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 very interesting. Gonna continue searching there, Dark Man, as we always say. Dan said Jeffries would destroy Frazier, just like Foreman. Not sure. Yeah, there's some points that I think it's arguable. There are certainly some traits that favor James J. Jeffries. Tough and rugged as far as Jeffries, and just big, strong, tough, rugged, as I mentioned. Think about George Foreman, of course. They're a big guy with a big punch there, but kind of different in terms of how they operated. So I don't know that a Frazier fight would go in the same capacity as that Foreman fight there. So I think it'll be a lot more interesting between Frazier and Jeffries than what we saw with the Foreman fights. But if you look at it from a size standpoint, there may be some things you could tie in similarly. But that being said, I don't think the fight in itself would operate in that fashion. Yeah. Foreman just, as you've even noted yourself, just one of those formidable punchers. I don't know that Jeffrey, while he was strong and he could certainly punch, yeah, just comparing that punching ability to Foreman's, yeah, certainly different. Uh, as Poland ball, in my opinion as well, there Poland ball certainly a different level of punch. Uh, yeah, I'd probably lean towards that distance side of things as well. There Poland ball for sure, but could Jeffries win? Most certainly, most certainly Jeffries could defeat Jay Frazier or Joe Frazier, just depending on the circumstances of the fight, the types of fight, especially going these long and grueling distances. And then thinking about the stage of their career, you think about the wars that Frazier had with Ali. Uh, in Ali, I mean, fast, sharp, uh, had a little more pop than what meets the eye. You think Jeffries would be a strong, tough, tough guy to just deal with, trying to muscle him around in the ring. So Jeffries would have certainly been capable, but that left hook of Frazier, I think it would have been landing as well. And, it could change the game, I'm sure, even if that meant opening up some cuts, things of that nature. I think you could most certainly see that happening. Polo Ball says Jeffries had power, but he wasn't the elite finisher Foreman was. Yeah, Foreman was most certainly one of those just brutal punching finishers, as you mentioned, just brutal with it. I mean, ragdolling opponents. Yeah, I think that's the way he was able to ragdoll Ken Norton, ragdolling Joe Frazier. Yeah, that's just a whole different level right there, in my opinion, for sure. Poland Ball says, I think he likely beats Frazier, though. Frazier will get bullied. So yeah, that's something that would be you have to factor in how it goes towards the tail end of the fight. And you think about, yeah, Frazier, he would still keep coming, he would still be game, and maybe to his own deficiency in terms of too much heart for his own good, because you certainly wouldn't expect to see Frazier backing down at any point, and therefore that could play into Jeffrey's favor, who, as I've been alluding to, is one of those individuals who was certainly game for being there in the tail end of a contest. Jeffries got today's money, 2 million for us, but Jeffries wasn't duped. Don't feel sorry for him. Most money ever paid at the time. Interesting. Speaking in terms of his overall purses for his career, because I know that they estimated John L. Sullivan made in excess of $1 million during his career, which would have been just an insane amount of money. Just thinking about it, or at least factoring in inflation at this point. Then, of course, we know Jack Dempsey and what he was able to generate. So they are up there in the higher echelon. But yeah, certainly Jeffries, I'd imagine, wasn't hurting. Excuse me, he was perfectly fine on his form doing his thing prior to that call to come step in with Jack Johnson. Alexander Cameron says Jeffries versus Foreman. Any picks right there? It's hard for me to go against my guy George Foreman, just thinking about the type of force that would be. I think it would be very interesting. Very interesting. I'd lean Foreman, but certainly Foreman couldn't, or it wouldn't be in his strong suit to, just recklessly just go for it like he did against Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle. He'd have to fight smart. He'd have to fight super smart, I'd imagine. So Poland Ball says, depends on if Jeffries can handle Foreman's power until he tires. I see a Lau versus Foreman type of fight happening. Yeah, interesting one to throw out there, Poland Ball. Yeah, that was a very interesting one. Yeah, and we saw Foreman take some heavy take some heavy shots, and it looked like he himself was about to be out of there. But that being said, he bounced back. So that was a good, interesting one right there. If Jeffrey Shins doesn't crack, he would outlast Foreman. Certainly, yeah. If Foreman got to the distance and especially had gassed himself out with a bunch of reckless throwing, yeah, that wouldn't spell too well for him there in the back end of the fight. So, like you said there, bowling ball. I kind of lean towards that as well. It all depends on what Foreman is doing there in the beginning of the contest, and as you mentioned, Jeffries holding up to that punishment, and he could be hit. He could be hit. So certainly would be a tough one. That's a very interesting one. Then Foreman was a pounder, pounded out everyone with many pounding shots. Jeffries same, except Jeffries had more one punch power than Foreman. Oh, you think so there, Dan? I don't know. I didn't view it as such. Not that one punch power, but hey, that's left to the interpretation. I would say that Foreman had more one punch power, but it's hard to say that Jeffries doesn't have one punch power in some sense, considering that he knocked out 16 of his opponents in those 19 victories. So, but I most certainly can say, and we don't have all the footage of, we don't have a ton of footage of Jeffries, but when you look at Foreman just compared to a number of heavyweights in history, just that power that he displays, it just looks different. It looks different than a number of heavyweights in history there. So that's an interesting one there, Dan. I'd be interested in knowing what others thought in that regard in terms of that one punch power, because I don't associate one punch power with James J. Jeffries, but he was a strong guy who most certainly could get a guy out of there. And I do associate one punch power with George Foreman. So interesting. That's interesting there, Dan. Brings about some thought. Alexander Campbell says, I can remember even in the 70s, Jacob's collection of fight films was huge. Okay, cool, Alexander. Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting right there. So you hear that, Dark Man. So yeah, he apparently had a huge collection. So man, I know he was on a quest for grab footage. From what I've read, he was on a quest for grab footage, and he may have been the one who got that training footage. I'm not sure, but you know, you hear some mentions. I think I mentioned this before, like Teddy Atlas and mentioning like, hey, Jim Jacobs, of course, and just out there at Catskills and just being around cuss and all that stuff. And then he's mentioning seeing footage of a lot of these older guys. I know he threw Grab out there once as well. And I don't know what Teddy was, if Teddy was alluding to this Grab training footage, or if he was just kind of mistaken, and of course knowing about Greb and knowing about a number of guys from that time, just kind of threw that out there, just in a sense, like, oh yeah, we've seen footage of all those guys: Harry Greb, James Jeffries, Jack Dempsey, you name it. So that's one of the questions I have in that regard, Alexander. So certainly interesting. One thing I think is certain: Jeffries Foreman's ain't going the distance. That would be an interesting one. Yeah, tough to see it. Yeah, tough to see it going the distance right there, Alexander. Most certainly tough to see it. Dan says, no one loves Foreman like Lee, but he didn't have the snap. Joe Louis punch had pounding the shit out of everyone. Yeah, Jeffries, one of maybe two fighters in history who could beat Foreman. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting there, Dan. Because, I mean, Foreman, yeah, he just had, it was just a brute thudding looking type of punch that he had, just winging those things, just bringing them in. It was just like a thudding looking power. He still had some of that power here today for the Big George Foreman film. I know they were doing some stuff with him. There's a film out, or a little short out there on him, where he's punching the heavy bag. You can see him even at this age still got some of that old classic Foreman power, the way he's pounding at that heavy bag. But yeah, hey, that's an interesting one. I need to dive into it a little bit myself, because you know, I don't, like I said, I don't associate that snap and that thudding punch power, or that one punch power with Jeffries. But as I mentioned, of course, he's a guy who had a lot of knockouts, and certainly, yeah, even if it comes later in a fight, you still have the, you know, it could still have the same effect, or it could still have some force that is equivalent to just being one of those snapping or thudding punchers. But that being said, I haven't necessarily associated him with such. But maybe I'll need to look a little deeper into it. I definitely want to look deeper into it. Rodolfo says, Foreman, salute to you, Rodolfo. I'm leaning there. Alexander Campbell says, my dad saw Foreman Frazier 1 on what was then called closed circuit TV. Okay, cool. That is awesome. That is pretty awesome. It's great being able to recollect on some of these stories, just thinking about some of these guys from the past, just being able to recollect on those fights, those times, and like family members, things of that nature, who might have been there, who might have been watching. Certainly, boxing has one of those type of presence just in the sport itself, especially that invokes a lot of discussion and thought over the course of history. So Poland Ball says Foreman didn't have snap? Question mark. Hey, he uh had some thudding. Yeah, I guess it depends on your interpretation of snap, because yeah, he seemed to have it for me, but I just know his punches, they look different for sure. So, and we don't have a ton of footage, as mentioned, of Jeffries to say, oh, or to be able to get a full glimpse, but we can see some stuff, and we know that he was a strong and powerful guy. But yeah, Foreman is one of those guys that when I just see him, his punching ability, and I think about those words that are tied to him, that's like snap, power, thudding, just brute blows, man, he's up there on the list. Certainly up there on the list right there. The top tier end of the list, you know. Certainly, in my opinion, Darkman says Lennox Lewis versus James Jeffries. What do you guys think? Yeah, that's a interesting one there. Certainly, I see Poland Ball. He says Lewis decisively, in my opinion. Uh, yeah, Lewis, big dude to deal with, big dude who can box and move well. You know, even you just think about even the younger version of Lewis. He was pretty quick and he could move very well. So I think, and he always had a pretty solid jab as well. We know he had that power. He could connect on something. Yeah, I'd probably lean in the direction of Lewis as well. I don't think that with the size of Lewis, I don't think Jeffries would be able to move him and push him around in a similar capacity than what he was able to do with some of the opponents he faced. So that would be a tough one for Jeffries right there as well. Of course, unless you throw in some of those outliers, caveats like, hey, is this a 45 rounder, this a 20 rounder taking place in Nevada in the heat, or whatever, depending on the conditions of when Jeffries are fought. So those are the type of factors you can throw in there, but just generally from their overall makeup, I think there are a number of strong suits that fall more in the Lions' favor. Lennox the Lion Lewis. Just want to thank you for bringing Jeffrey's names up. Hey, no problem, Tim. Hey, Jeffries, hell of a fighter right there. One of the great heavyweight champions that we've seen. And realistically, he's one of those guys he's very intriguing from a matchup perspective, which is why we're throwing some of these matchups out here, because Jeffries, he had a style that, despite, the lack of footage and all that stuff, and what we know of him and his style, I mean, I think it just translates pretty much in any era. Big, strong, tough guy with endurance who can mix it up on the inside. I think he would just be a tough challenge, or a tough guy to deal with, and would be formidable in pretty much any era. So that's what makes it intriguing when dealing with or just throwing out matchups with Jeffries, and the fact that he didn't have a ton of fights. So you think like, okay, yeah, there's probably a lot more that was left in the tank that we didn't get to see. So Poland Ball says, I heard that Jimmy Jacobs can be an unreliable source. Oh, I heard he used to troll his coworkers by placing a fake video tape on their desk with a big unfilmed fight names, but they actually be duds. That's funny. That's funny. So he's a jokester. Oh, I'd be like, oh, how foul of you. How foul of you there, Jim. So yeah, I'm not too familiar with the overall detail of that of the records that he had, or at least those films, the footage and all stuff. But that's very interesting. There's this one guy, I think Steve Lott. I think he had some stuff, or at least I know he was big on the history. I think he passed away a few years ago. As a matter of fact, he was another one who I know was big in the history. I believe he may have had some footage and stuff that he was tied to in some capacity. Dan Foreman is a monster, pounding everyone out with many punches. Gil Clancy, Foreman's trainer, says this is a pound out monster, lack snap, but not that whack snap night. All right, interesting. Hey, Gil Clancy coming from Gil Clancy. So yeah, interesting there. I'm gonna dive into that a bit more there, Dan. Invoke some good thought here. Rodolfo says people were saying it was a body double that punched you in the bag, but who knows? You think so, Rodolfo? I didn't hear that, but that would be pretty damn funny. That would be pretty funny if they went and pulled one of those switcheroos on us now. Hold up there. Tim, wow, my big finger. Yes, people should know more about Jeffries. Oh, certainly. Yeah, one of the foremost champions in the history of the heavyweight division there. Hey, and he carried that torch there for a while. He was a pretty dominant guy. Pretty dang dominant. He would have been tough. A tough matchup is mentioned for any during that period there, Tim. So that's good stuff. If Foreman would have had good stamina, he would have been the greatest. Yeah, that stamina, yeah, that can make or break some fighters. We've seen it all the time where a fighter they could be leading, then get there towards the tail end, and it all goes out the window. Alexander Campbell, Liston had a more clubbing type of power. Oh yeah, certainly. I think a lot of youngsters don't realize that how great a fighter Sonny was. Most certainly, Alexander is coming from the great state of Arkansas, where I hail as well. Sonny Liston, but yeah, man, the way you're just right, just club. Man, you just see those hooks he's landing on. For instance, freaking Floyd Patterson, and basically ragdolling Floyd Patterson in there. And Liston, yeah, underrated heavyweight right there. I know I just put out that little poll of Liston versus Ken Norton, which is a very interesting one, right? That'll be very interesting because Liston, he could punch. He had a long reach, solid jab. And man, you really look at his career outside of the two Ali fights, it's pretty solid. Of course, there's always questions of his age and all of that stuff. So he could have been one of those older fighters as well, older than what he listed at. And he was out there and he was a force. And he was still going hard even prior to him dying. He went on a huge run and then he lost to Leotis Martin. But that being said, Liston, underrated fighter right there. Mysterious fighter. The Murder of Sonny Liston. There's a book that I've gone through. Brings up a lot of questions, but I know there are a lot of others out there on the great Sonny. I had considered doing something myself. But that being said, very interesting man, still a mythical figure in the sport, that Sonny Liston, for sure. Dark man, yes, something in my gut tells me that Lewis would win against the Boilermaker. I wonder if Ali could defeat Jeffries in both of their prime and what would happen in a Liston versus Jeffries. Yeah, that's another big punching matchup right there in terms of Liston's Jeffries. Just thinking about them there on the inside, but Liston, he had that type of jab that was very solid to kind of work from distance if he needed to as well, and it was a jab that had a little bit of, I guess you could say, snap to it, Liston. So that's a very intriguing one right there, Dark man. And then Ali, Ali, it's no secret. I view him as the number one heavyweight of all time. So I think Ali would have danced in a beautiful way, pulling out that victory decision. You just never know. But certainly I would lean on Ali in most scenarios. In a series of fights, hey, you never know. Things could change. Things could certainly change. Dan, most Jeffries KOs were one punch. Fitzsimmons, one body punch. Corbett was winning to a whack. One perfect left hook. Good night, Corbett. All right there, Dan. Yeah, I know. Yeah, he got those guys out of there for sure. He did get them out of there and sent them down and out for sure. So that is that is interesting for sure. Dartman says Alexander, yeah, Liston was a hell of a fighter. Demolition ball, yeah. Demolition ball like jab, hooks, crosses, and swings from hell and brutal body punches. Yes, certainly. Yeah, people thought that Ali or young Cassius Clay was about to get destroyed going in there with Liston, just thinking like, what the heck? Are you serious? This kid ready for Sonny Liston, who was just a mean dude in there, just a man in there in the ring. Came from rough upbringing, was out there, always involved in that street life to a certain degree. Just a force for sure. Dan says, I got Foreman and Jeffries side, number one greatest heavyweights in history. Okay, cool, cool. All right, yeah, those are two that I hold in high regards as well, myself. Certainly, I think you can make an argument. There are arguments that could be made in certain ways. I have Ali Lewis, certainly as far as my 1 and 2, but I know a lot of people have Lewis number one, and there might be some who have others number one. I think that, yeah, a lot of people will have varying opinions. There are opinions that maybe more of the mass leans towards, but yeah, if you had someone else inside of your top 10 or your number one heavyweight, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a wrong answer. It's an opinion, and there are some things that you may like and favor more than the next guy. So yeah, hey, if you got Foreman and Jeffries there, hey, I can't argue against it. I mean, those are two top heavyweights in the history of the sport. Any way you slice it, two tops in the history of the sport. So salute there, Dan. Pull them all. Jeff also outweighed Corbett by 30 and Fitz by 47 pounds. Yeah, that is true. Jeffries had power, but I see no evidence that it was on the level of Foreman. Yeah, those weight factors, that was legitimate. Certainly some weight factors. We know that for sure Fitzsimmons started below middleweight. As far as Corbett, he was never a big heavyweight. Of course, solid fundamentally, but as far as heavyweight's concerned, never a big heavyweight. So it is pretty interesting. You're right, but yeah, that weight factor, that is something that is thrown in the mix there. So yeah, I just think, yeah, of course, I'm with you in that. Foreman, it has some pretty standout type of just power and pop amongst the best or the best and the biggest punchers in the history of the sport. So certainly different. Sullivan was more powerful, in my opinion, judging from results. Hey, I think that's legitimate right there, Poland Ball. I think that is legit right there from all accounts of what I've picked up on Sullivan as well. I'm in agreement with you right there. As a matter of fact, I know on the channel I have one of those little fantasy matchup videos. Yeah, I think Sullivan did have a good deal of power. That was his strong suit offensively. He was an offensive guy first and foremost, and he had a lot of knockouts to back it up. You could argue, as far as the resume at the top level, Jeffries has a better resume, but as far as just the power in general, yeah, Sullivan was a force. Most certainly a knockout artist, a knockout artist. I wish we had some video of him. That would be dope. Jeffrey's physical strength is more significant. He used to train with a 350-pound sandbag. Yeah, that's insane right there, Poland Ball. Yeah, that physicality aspect of it. So, yeah, that's where the game changes right there. Yeah, he was definitely, man, just one of those physical dudes. And what he put into the training certainly paid dividends for him as a fighter. Poland Ball says the fact that he was an incredible physical specimen influenced his fights much more than his power did. Jeff is arguably the greatest conditioned heavyweight ever. Certainly, hey, that's worth a nod right there. Certainly, and that's what makes it intriguing, kind of throwing them into matches, because you think that if something is going deep into a fight, then yeah, it seems to favor Jeffrey. So that ability to withstand, and then that ability to actually continue to be able to apply force there in the latter stages of a contest, that is stand out. So I think that is definitely a standout attribute for him, certainly. And there are some others who were super conditioned as well. Joe Jeanette, think about him. He's one of those guys. Think about some of the others that are out there that we've seen in history who could withstand, I mean, Marciano, etc. But Jeffries right up there. I mean, yeah, you could argue certainly him being number one, especially given that he was doing it in his time. in lesser conditions, I would say, uh, by comparison to some of the others that came after him. Darkman, do you guys see the brutal KO that Liston gave to Albert Westphal? Liston straight smacked him into the canvas so hard to show you that to anyone else that would think Westfall is dead. I need to check that out. I don't remember it here off thinking about it. I've seen a number of things. I don't remember this one off top there, Dark Man. Gonna have to check that one out for sure. Maybe seeing it will rejog my memory. But that's pretty crazy. That is pretty crazy, but certainly not something unseen from the great uh, Sony Liston. Alexander Campbell, Liston beat Foley and Williams at their very best. Certainly did. Certainly did. Man, handled them. Man, see him in there with Big Cat, Cleveland Williams, another big puncher for the time. And hey, Liston gave it to him. So 2 times Cleveland Williams in his primes. Liston KOs him, day and there dropping it. So yes, sir. Yeah, Liston, man. Of course, when Liston lost the title, he was not a day under 40. Yeah, that's always one of those interesting when it comes to the age of Sonny Liston. And of course, not having any records. I think it was noted that he didn't have a birth certificate, which is not unsurprising. Heck, I'm from Arkansas. And especially when you get into some of those rural areas, there's a lot lacking. It's almost like you're in a different country at times. It's so rural, and some people are for the rural outskirts nature of living. But certainly, yeah, I don't think anyone has a definitive pulse on exactly how old Sonny Liston was. It's kind of in a range there, Alexander. He's somewhere in a range. We have a general idea. You've seen varying dates or whatever. So I think just a range as far as the years even. It's pretty interesting. Pretty interesting. Dartman says another fighter KO matchup would have been Tyson versus Jeffries, Wilder versus Jeffries. Yeah, all interesting right there. Yeah, certainly interesting. I haven't thought of those for sure. Have not thought of those. Wilder has, of course, the pop in his punch, but I don't know. Jeffries, yeah, I think he'd probably be a better boxer than Wilder. So Wilder, he'd just be looking for that one shot. So it'll be interesting for sure. And then Tyson, Tyson, hey, he's a tough one. Just matching up with any and everyone. A lot of people have varying opinions. That would have been an interesting one right there. You have to think that the fight going the distance favors Jeffries in there with Tyson, of course, with Wilder as well. So it's very interesting. Oh, man, just imagine it. Prime Sullivan versus Prime Jeffries, brutal destruction. Yes, that would have been an interesting one right there. Very interesting. But, yeah, I do lean in the direction of Sullivan, but it's not like by a ton. Not by a ton. And, heck, certain situations would change things. Most certainly. Jeffries would likely take the beating of a lifetime against Tyson. Whether or not he can take the beating and outlast Tyson is uncertain. That'll be an interesting one there, Poland Ball. That would certainly be an interesting one. Fight. I don't know. I don't think the intimidation factor would be a thing. And Tyson, that's my favorite boxer for sure. Now, yeah, that'd be very interesting. Certainly, I like what Tyson can do at his peak. Yeah, that would have been a lot to deal with. But just thinking about, I think it all comes down to kind of how this fight or how these contests carry out in the latter portions there. But there are some things that lean in Jeffrey's favor. But of course, the condition, that's always the outlier, and that's always the game changer in a sense. Dan says Cleveland 10 years before Ali, cops just shot Cleveland in the stomach with the 357 Magnum. Cleveland was partially paralyzed one side when Ali gave him a great payday Cleveland needed. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I don't think I know of that right there, Dan. That is interesting. That's one of the fights that I always highlight is Ali putting on an absolutely brilliant display right there. And I hold it in high regards just for seeing just Ali, just the way he's able to move in there against Cleveland. The speed of those punches with the snap behind him in combination, just like unseen. unseen. That level of speed, just different. Different. I pull him out. I don't think Jeffries' poor defense would work out well for him against Wilder, but who knows? Maybe he can bully Wilder. Yeah, it'd be interesting. Wilder would have the height and reach on him for sure, but they'd be around the same weight. You know, Wilder, he was like 214 coming into that first contest with Fury. And Fury, hey, he's bigger than Jeffrey. So, yeah, it's interesting. Certainly interesting to see, to think about Jeffries dealing with such. Just thinking about that size, I guess you can say Wilder has a type of pop that he can drop most, if not all, heavyweights if he catches them right. So yeah, this would be the fundamentals I think would come into play potentially, but who knows? Who knows? It's a very interesting one. I had to think about that one a bit more myself right there. But of course, you look at resumes and just their standing. Of course, it's Jeffries right now. All day. But that being said, just in an individual matchup, very interesting. Very interesting. I had to think about that one a bit more. Certainly have to think about that one. Interesting one. Prime Sullivan, Prime Jeffries is one of my favorite matchups. Can't pick a winner though, especially without footage of Prime Sullivan. Yeah, that's always a factor that is thrown in there. So as mentioned, polo ball, I did a video on the channel. Matter of fact, I need to go back and look at it because I don't remember exactly all the details I put in the video in itself. But I know I lean towards Sullivan in that video as well. Just thinking about the accounts of how he operated, I think he had in it, at least at his peak, his endurance was up there. I think he was capable of lasting the distance and still having, some success and some pop, just as Jeffries would have been. So that's the reason why I think that it would have been very interesting for it'd have been a very interesting contest, but I would have leaned Sullivan. But that could change. I had to dig into it further and see if I have a change of heart right now. But that's kind of how it is. I had a change of heart in terms of who I viewed with Jackson and Sullivan, and I viewed that Peter Jackson would get denied. But that being said, by the same token, in one of the videos I did back, I had Sullivan potentially getting a knockout. But as I became privy to more information, I had to go with Jackson. So a lot of stuff to factor in. Alexander Campbell says Vitaly Klitschko versus Jeffrey. These are all these 6'7", other 6'7" guy out there, bigger than Wilder. As far as overall weight, there'll be a lot of weight to deal with. And then you just think about Vitaly Klitschko with that jab out there. I don't know. That might not be a good fight right there. I can't see that being a fight that I would necessarily want to see right there, Alexander Campbell. Maybe Vitaly Klitschko wins by virtue of outpointing him with a million jabs or something right there. But that's an interesting one, Alex. Very interesting. Dan Sullivan dominated like no one. 500 fights, all wins from the late 1870s, 1990. To 1890. He needs some credit, right? Certainly, yeah. Dominant. One of the most dominant we've seen in the sport. Pulling Ball says Jeffries does poorly against good jabbers. I don't think he'll do well against the Klitschko, bro. Yeah, that'd be a very interesting fight and likely not a very good fight to watch in terms of just thinking about it stylistically. That'd be an interesting one. Interesting one right there. It might be worth throwing in the mix there. Alexander, I'd be interested in seeing what other people would say. Dan says Vitch coach will last 2 seconds with any of these guys, especially our man of the day, Jeffries. All right. Tell us how you really feel there, Dan. Tell us how you really feel. Polar Ball says Sullivan's resume might not be the best, but to say he fought nobody is untrue. He beats many formidable fighters like Greenfield, Mitchell, Kilrain, Burt, Donovan, another. Oh, who said he fought nobody? Somebody said he didn't fight anybody. Yeah, he had some. He had some good. He had some good wins on there. You're right. In addition, Dominic McCaffrey. another solid fighter from that particular time who we got a win over. Think about Patty Ryan. Now, Patty, of course, he started in the world of bare knuckle, but he moved over to boxing. And, hey, he was one of the first names, even though it was under London prize ring rules, that elevated Sullivan. But in addition, yeah, Sullivan, he was doing a ton of exhibitions, all that good stuff. So, yeah, Sullivan, hey, he had some pretty solid names on his resume just overall. I think at the top level, though, yeah, I would say that Jeffries, yeah, had, but it is, they're pretty interesting. They're pretty interesting, because both had Corbett. At least they have a common opponent, which is interesting. But yeah, I may be leaning at the top level of Jeffries resume wise, but Sullivan, hey, he racked up a ton of victories. So, and yeah, you're right. He was in with some guys, and a lot of guys who were like real true fighters for sure. So that's a good one. Then joke fight Ali against totally shot Cleveland 10 years, a couple of three. You think that's what did it? Hey, it was a brilliant display right there, Dan, from Ali. Regardless, seeing Ali the way he was moving in there, just fluid poetry in motion. And then he took out Zora Fali, similar fashion. I know Zora Fali, he was a veteran of the game, got a payday from this. I like the fact that Ali fought these guys. They got their payday, but they came in trying to do what they do. Tough dealing with Ali. Salute to you. WR1791 says Jeffries, a modern trainer, would be larger and more powerful. Jeffries is a superior boxer to both Tyson and Wilder. Oh, yeah, interesting. Yeah, you can make that argument, certainly, just as far as standing in the sport in itself and looking at what they were able to accomplish in their careers and then just their overall makeup. Tyson, the more fundamentally sound of both of those, or of that trio right there. Of course, I think the level of fundamentals that Tyson possessed was far beyond those two. But we know when Tyson started looking for that power only, then that didn't bode well for him. But certainly, I think that Jeffries would certainly benefit more from some of the modern training and things of that nature. And that would prove to be, things that would help him. So he'd probably have some even stronger attributes, most certainly. But still at the fundamental level, yeah, I like Tyson fundamentally over both of those guys, skill-wise. A lot of BS there, you say? Like Jeffrey's resume, Sullivan's best opponents were often very undersized, but to their credit, they did often perform well against other heavy. Still matters, though. Yeah, certainly does. Certainly does. You're right. Charlie Mitchell dropped John L. Sullivan. First man to drop him. Charlie Mitchell is like a 660 pounder. He fought at heavyweight. He was a heavyweight. That's what he's considered as. But if you really look at him today, or at least even then, he's more middleweight. So yeah, you're right. There were some smaller guys that were in there against in some cases, but of course we know they fought some big guys as well. Sullivan, yeah, he fought some. There were some big guys on his resume. Some, of course, not as experienced. But that being said, yeah, I think that's a good point to make there. How about Marciano versus Jeffrey? Me, Poland, and Flack are arguing about this, and yeah, I put a little poll up on the channel, and that one was surprisingly interesting. I think the majority of people selected Rocky Marciano, but I think it's a tough one. It's a tough one for sure because I think that both of them had strength and endurance. Those were two strong suits. Who's stronger? I don't know. Pound for pound, who's stronger? Maybe Rocky Marciano, if you think about it. But we know that Jeffries was a big, strong, brute guy. So maybe that nullifies the thought that Marciano was stronger, who would be giving up, probably, 20, 30 pounds on Jeffries. So that makes it interesting right there. I think Jeffries, I see it being a distance fight. It'd be interesting. I'll have to see what you all think there, Rodolfo. Who y'all thought would get the victory there? I think there's an argument can be made both ways as far as both guys. There's some arguments that can be made, uh, especially if it gets there to the back end, tail end of it. Might even get a little ugly, not from a fouling standpoint, but just the two of them. When that attrition starts kicking in, neither one in the back down, they're just kind of battling it out. It might get a little ugly there, but man, that's an interesting one right there. Guys to win and be victorious, but hey, Marciano, man, he's endurance demon right there as well. So he'd be right there in the mix. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think certain scenarios can certainly dictate things. That's a tough one. I need to think about that a bit more myself. I need to think about it. Dark man, imagine a heavyweight with all the with the fighting style of Greb, the cardio chin, toughness of Greb, Marciano informing the experience of more Greb and the power of listening and the IQ of Ali. Unbeatable right there. You can't pack all of that into a single heavyweight right there, Dark man. That's unbeatable. That's a fight night character. We can create him. We can create him for sure. Poland Ball says, by all accounts, Sullivan had much faster hands and more volume than Jeff. Yeah, certainly, man. Sullivan, he was no slouch in there. He came out gunning. I kind of allude to that in pretty much any video I've done on Sullivan, but he came out gunning, looking for war. He was offensive minded. You can see him in that little footage of him there messing around with Corbett. He's showing you he likes to throw that left over the top. Then kind of feint. Hey, he was out there doing that. He was working some stuff. So I think he's better than what people think he is. Some consider him just a brawler, and I guess you can argue, yeah, he was a brawler in some sense, but it's not as though he was without any knowledge of the game or how to operate. He worked with a number of trainers throughout his career. You could see that he was developing. Now, of course, he did hit a point where he wasn't focused, and therefore, yeah, things most certainly dropped off from there. But certainly at his peak in his prime, he was a tough cookie to deal with there, Poland Ball, as you mentioned. Just quick out the gates, just quick going blasting these guys offensively. You just see them charge up, just giving them that work. You can see him in that picture there in that Kill Rain fight where he's standing there. He's got that left arm down, got that right hand caught, ready to snipe that thing in there. Probably he might have been sniping that in there on Kill Rain during that bare knuckle contest in 1889. Alex says Goddard fought a draw with Jackson, dropped him twice. All the newspapers thought Goddard won. Goddard was a fighter very similar to Sullivan, only nowhere near like the great John L. Oh yeah, Goddard. Yeah, he was a good fighter. I can't remember when that happened. That might have been early, right, against Peter Jackson. Because I know Bill Farnan, he was also someone early in his career, gave it to Peter Jackson, as a matter of fact. But then Peter Jackson, as he developed, he went on a pretty massive run there. But Joe Goddard, yeah, tough dude, tough resume there. Australian with a very tough resume. So yeah. I favor John L over Goddard as well. Goddard, he's in some tough matchups, man. Took some punishment. He could dish it out as well, though. He could most certainly dish it out. So that's an interesting one, though. There, Alex Goddard's one of the greatest fighters ever. A nut, though. Oh yeah, I know you've mentioned that, Dan, for sure. And then Harry Lang. New Zealander right there, I believe, right? So I think he's from New Zealand. But yeah, he was undefeated and only lost to Paddy Slavin. So Frank Slavin, he was one that would have been interesting. I know he and Jackson fought, but he was someone that wanted to fight Sullivan. He had pop. He was 6'3", about 200 pounds. There were times he was like 190, but you could see him being 6'3", just a solid dude who could punch. And he would have made for an interesting matchup with Sullivan. Darkman, watch out, 86. Marciano haters will arrive to the stream like in the shirt. That's funny. Hey, I feel you, Darkman. Yeah. Hey, there's some fighters you bring up their names. It's polarizing, and triggers a lot of stuff right there. There certainly Marciano is one of those. But hey, got to give Marciano his props, being an undersized heavyweight and what he was able to accomplish, and just knowing what he put into the training aspect of it, that mental piece of it, man, just tough. Because when it's all said and done, when you're both in the ring, you both reach that point where you don't have as much physically, or at least you think you don't, then it's going to come down to that mentally tough. Rocky Marciano, one of the all-timers for sure. Definitely favoring Jeff in this matchup, but it would be worth to watch. Good stuff there, Poland Ball. Yeah, that's a very interesting one for me right there, Jeffries versus Marciano. There are some aspects that, as mentioned, makes it very, very intriguing because Jeffries is going to be bigger. Jeffries, like I said, will have a good number of pounds on him, but Marciano, we know, was accustomed to fighting some guys who were bigger. But yeah, just think if it was a 25 rounder or something, you might say that kind of bodes well for Jeffries, But we do know that Marciano was a hell of a trainer, so I guess you can conceive that he could potentially, hang in there for beyond that 15-round limit. We know that he was supremely conditioned. That's interesting to think about. That's a good one there, Poland Ball, as you mentioned. Yeah, one, I just had to dig a little further on it. But, yeah, I think I could go either way, almost a coin flip in certain scenarios. Then Bob Satterfield KO Cleveland Williams 14 years before Ali. Okay, old Bob Satterfield, I remember him. Was he light heavyweight champion? Bob Satterfield, or champion of what? Let me see. Bob Satterfield. I got to double check. I don't know a ton about him, but I remember him though. Bob Satterfield. But also he was heavyweight only, so he didn't fight for the light heavyweight championship. Yeah, I was looking him up right there. But Bob Satterfield. Not to dive into it. But yeah. So yeah, Cleveland Williams. But I mean, yeah, somebody got him. Hey, he was known to be a big puncher. So yeah, but yeah, some guys, that chin, it could be touched. Alexander Cameron, Rocky's punches would have as much steam on him in the 15th as the first. Certainly something that factors in right there, Alex. Yeah, that's something I'm thinking about. Like, he could go the distance without a doubt. Dan listing twice KO Cleveland 8 years before Ali. Cops shot him, left him for dead 1 year before great Ali performance. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so that certainly wasn't the, I guess you could say, best version of Cleveland Big Cat Williams. Was he on a streak at that time coming into the Ali fight? Wasn't he on a streak of some type? Let me see. But yeah, that would have been a tough one. Yeah, he was on a pretty solid streak, but yeah, no real huge names. Sonny Banks, I guess, is. He knocked down Ali. So, yeah, he was on a little win streak, but definitely not one to write much about or write home about for sure. Dartman says, I agree those hands were so fast for his age. I even saw Corbett's reaction was slower than Sullivan. Of course, it's also easier moving just the hands that the whole body into a punch. But I think that Sullivan in his prime must be a thunderbolt brawler with very tight clinching. Yes. Hey, he was certainly Dartman. He was, and he had a little girth to him. He wasn't a huge guy, but he was a solid guy. He was up over 200 pounds, especially in the latter portion of his career. So he was a solid guy. He had some broadness to him. We can see that in the pictures, especially as he got older. The Jackson Goddard was in 1890 or 91. Okay, gotcha. Alexander Campbell, so they happened in 1890 or 1891. Interesting. I have to check that out. Yeah, I couldn't remember. I was thinking it was earlier, but I'll certainly have to look into that. Dartman Sullivan in his prime must be. Oh yeah, we just mentioned that. Dan said possibly the best heavyweight ever is Jack Broughton, 27 years, never lost a fight till finally Jack Slack beat him. Broughton made the first boxing gloves and wrote the first boxing rules book. Oh yeah, Jack Broughton. Yeah, I don't know a ton about him, but I know he's one of the godfathers of um, modern boxing. James Figg as well. I did a photo animation video on both of those guys that are out there. Matter of fact, Broughton and Fig, they have some pictures that look alike, so I might have a mix of both of them in both videos, to be honest. But yeah, I don't know a ton about Broughton, but yeah, I know that he was very instrumental during his time or whatever. So that is an interesting one for sure. But hey, there are some other guys who are from that era of the early days, especially when it was just kind of bare knuckle, different type of sport in some sense, without rules, lacking rules. But yeah, imagine Broughton, deserves his credit. But yeah, I don't know a ton about him. I've thought about diving into some of the early guys of going way back to like the 1700s and early 1800s. But I know there's some individuals out there who dive into that already who may have, kind of more cachet built up just kind of in and around and knowing some of those guys. I know some of the bare knuckle guys, but certainly not enough of them to, wrap my head around who all of the major players were. I know a lot of the names. Of course, I've mentioned, oh yeah, Jack Slack was grandson of James Figg. Okay, cool. Yeah, I remember Fig. Yeah, I guess I don't recall Slack. That's good. That's good stuff there, Dan. Educating, educating me on this whole old world version of boxing, or at least when they started to establish some of the rule sets behind it. That's pretty cool, though. I had to look a little bit deeper into those guys. Yeah, he was a brutal boxer. I think he's one of the best. Marciano forever. Fun fact is that in Spanish, Marciano means alien, and Marciano, like the aliens, was truly out of this world. Good stuff there, Dark Man. Good stuff. Great little nugget there tying it together. I didn't know that. Alien. Rocky the Alien Marciano. Let's do it. There's a good YouTube channel for the Broughton era called English Martial Arts. Okay, good stuff there, Polar Ball. Salute. So that's good. I'll have to check them out. The English Martial Arts. The English Martial Arts. I'm gonna check them out for sure because I want to know more about it. I'm in a Facebook group. I think Darren Dobson owns it or is like the admin over it, and he knows a lot about the bare knuckle era. He's on Facebook. Salute, Darren. He's been here before, but it's been a minute. But anyway, and it's called the Ungloved Era. One of those groups on Facebook. Dropped a lot of good gems and knowledge of some of those guys from that time. So good stuff. I heard Flack wants the FIFA smoke 86. With who? Me or you? Flack don't want it. You know how I get down. Did you tell him what I did to you, Rodolfo? Come on now. You know how I get down. I ain't running from it. Let's do it. I'll pull an all-nighter just to get that dub. Don't think I won't. Then Cleveland was on a partially paralyzed streak before Ali. A lot of BS in boxing history. Oh yeah, interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know a ton about Cleveland's background, so I didn't know about him being shot with a 357, which I know they can do some heavy damage for sure. They can most certainly do some heavy damage. Rodolfo brought up that FIFA. Love Rodolfo. You know the deal. We have unfinished business. Alexander Kimball says Broughton wrote the first set of rules, the rules that eventually became the London prize fight rules. Okay, cool. Yeah, London prize fight rules. Yeah, so that's what's up. I know, some of those guys, they were fighting some skin tight gloves. So, or I guess you mentioned the low ounce gloves that are pretty much there at that level at least. So interesting. So yeah, Jack Broughton, man, pioneering there. I know about some of those other guys. Of course, I've mentioned them before. Mendoza, Bill Richmond, Tom Molyneux, Tom Cribb. Know about guys like that. And then, some of the other guys who fought bare knuckle, who I've mentioned on this channel or done a video on, Jim Smith, Professor Mike Donovan, of course, Jake Kilrain, Sullivan did a few times. We always note that. But yeah, a lot of it's very interesting for sure. Darkman says I used to, but my Xbox is kind of broken. Got to get it fixed soon. All right, Darkman. Hey, let us know. Let us know. Never ducking any smoke in FIFA. Never ducking it, Rodolfo. Nice. I'm the only PlayStation guy out of the group. Yeah, I used to be with them back in the day, Rodolfo. Back in the when they first came out, I had the PlayStation, the first one and the second one, and then from there I went Xbox, which I've been with since. Good stuff there, Rodolfo. You know how it goes down. Alexander Campbell says, "Fig time. There were no rules. They sometimes even use swords. Yeah, that's crazy. That is crazy. Yeah, I heard about some of the stuff that was allowed in some of those fights. Of course, those spiked shoes and yeah, hearing about guys getting spiked and crap. Yeah, that's crazy. The eye gouging and stuff. I was mentioning hearing about Tom Molyneux getting his fingers broken and stomped on, all that crap. So yeah, those rule sets were certainly they could certainly be bent in favor of a particular fighter on any given day. Yeah. Darkman says, yeah, it would be amazing to play with you guys. All right, Darkman, certainly. Hey, we're gonna be back in the mix there for sure. We're gonna make some stuff happen. We were playing this weekend. If you got Insta, I can add you in our group chat. Oh yeah, certainly there, Darkman. But yeah, we were going at it. We were going at it. That's funny right there. Rodolfo knows the deal. Some unfinished business right there, Rodolfo. And Flack as well in Fight Night. So we'll see what's up for sure. But man, yeah, this has been great. Yeah, appreciate it. So yeah, we're talking about the great James J. Jeffries, one of the great heavyweights. I think in summation, of course, we all know that he is one of the top tier heavyweights in the history of the sport. Big time names on his resume, as mentioned, packed into a 24 fight career, which is not a ton, but it's about what you do with those fights. Of course, notable fights. I'll just throw them out there. Some the notable Hall of Fame level fights involved with Joe Truinsky, Peter Jackson, Tom Sharkey, Bob Fitzsimmons, James J. Corbett, Jack Johnson, then a slew of other individuals that he was in there with, from Bob Armstrong, Hank Griffin, just guys who put in a lot of work in and around during that era. A multitude of guys. I think Poland Ball had mentioned Jack Monroe. Another guy, he had probably like 11 or 12 fights or something like that. And there were a lot of them were tough, a lot of tough. So some guys definitely had the smaller career total fight numbers, but packed a lot in between them for sure. Packed a lot in between them. But James J. Jeffries, world heavyweight champion, and a very solid one. And I think, if I haven't alluded to this, but I think I have, one of those heavyweights that can translate eras. When you think about that, as mentioned, we kind of went over some of the things that he was good at, some of the things some of the areas where he may have lacked, but certainly translatable across any era, just given some of the strong suits that he brings to the table. And I think that just kind of adds to the legacy of James J. Jeffries. So it took a hit when he lost to Jack Johnson there in 1910, but not necessarily enough to the degree that here over time we've been able to recognize just how good James J. Jeffries was and the circumstances surrounding that fight. So certainly one of the foremost champions to lace them up. Oh yeah, he's got you. Dark man. This is funny. We're gonna see what's up. Dan says Dempsey and numerous others rank Jeffries best fighter any weight class all time. Yep, that speaks volumes right there. Yeah, Jeffries was highly regarded. So you have those guys showing him respect and love there. And then as time goes on, we've seen other guys paying homage to the fighters of the past. That's one thing here that, of course, talking about the boxing history, and what we can associate with just the overall history of the sport. just thinking about that, it's good to be able to actually share thoughts and such surrounding these historic fighters, because as time goes on, there are new individuals popping up, and there are new boxers throwing their name in the hat, etc. And some of the old timers get forgot in some sense. Some of the old timers get forgot, and being able to just kind of share some of that knowledge, share some of the stories, having a passion for the history and kind of diving into some of these careers, I think it does wonders for getting these individuals their recognition in a time where it's hard to keep someone's attention for longer than 60 seconds or so. So, salute to all with an interest in the boxing history for sure. Darkman says, "Oh, imagine Langford versus Jeffries, both at their prime, and Langford in heavyweight. Interesting fight. Interesting fight right there." Yep. Yeah, it's a very interesting fight there, Darkman. What do you guys think? Rodolfo, I'll take Langford. Dan, tough one for Langford. Yeah, certainly a tough one for Langford, because that size is going to be the size is going to be a factor now in his prime. Of course, Langford, he could get bigger guys out of there, so I can see him being there, and I would think that he would have enough, just in the tank himself to be able to stand in there and go the distance as well. Be an interesting one. That'd be a very interesting one. But, the size is certainly on Jeffrey's side, and that's what Langford would have to deal with. It'll depend on how he handles that. And we've seen him handle some bigger guys. Bill Lang was bigger than him, and we saw Langford essentially walking Bill Lang down. But Bill Lang is no James J. Jeffries. Let me see how big Bill Lang was. Bill Lang, Australian. So Bill Lang, they have him at 6'1", 76.5-inch reach. So somewhat comparable from a height perspective to Jeffries, somewhat comparable. And he weighed anywhere from, it looked like he's been as, well, according to this thing, as low as the 60s. So he's kind of risen. Let me see what he weighed in when he fought Sam Langford. So 1911. So Bill Langford was 203. Sam Langford was 166. Crazy. So yeah, I think Langford would be able to handle himself fairly well. He'd be able to handle himself fairly well, regardless of the size, for sure. So yeah, that's a tough one. I might lean Langford, but it's hard to just definitively say he goes out there and handles Jeffries, given that size and strength of Jeffries, and of course he could withstand. It'd be interesting to see how Jeffries handles the power of Langford. Even though Langford would be smaller, but just what he's bringing to the table from a punch perspective. So that makes it pretty intriguing. That was a good one there, Dark Man. Very intriguing. Dan says, good question. Langford is a heavyweight. Who are the greatest heavyweights Langford beat? None. I hate to bust the bubble. Bill Hulang. No, what do you mean there, Dan? Langford beat Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette. He had multiple fights with Sam McVeigh, multiple fights with Joe Jeanette. He had multiple fights with Harry Wills. I mean, it's a who's who of heavyweights, and this is him being undersized. In his prime, he was just a force. Of course, he was in there with Johnson, though he was smaller at the time. But Lang, he's an Australian heavyweight. And Australia had a lot of heavyweights over the years who were certainly. Langford Jeffries is an incredibly difficult matchup to determine. I take Langford on points. Bowling ball with you there for sure. With you. Langford be better heavyweights than both Johnson and Jeffries. LMAO. Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, that's no question right there. So, Dan, yeah, I don't know what you're saying. Who did he beat? You got to go look at that resume. They all beat him as much, too. Well, Langford, he fought past it, and he had some situations where he was fighting outside of his prime, of course. And this is already being a guy who came up from a lower weights, but he was fighting these guys who were pretty much full-fledged heavyweights, and we know Langford started below lightweight, so that has to be factored in. He was able to knock these guys out. He was in there with the individuals I mentioned amongst a slew of others. So Langford, I think he's shown that he has the resume and just the overall pedigree just backing him when you dive into it, that he's a force to deal with for any fighter in history, pretty much across any weight class, considering where he started. Langford beat Joe Gans at 17 years of age. Sam Langford in there with Joe Gans, one of the greatest lightweights in history. Langford's in there with him and would have been lightweight champion. It was a weight situation, but would have been lightweight champion. The big three made a lot of money fighting each other. Jeanette, Sam, McVeigh. Who else? You had others. Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost Jeff Clark, another guy with a super tough resume who was a heavyweight in around there. But yeah, if you want to go through, Langford, we certainly had to start from the early days, the smaller days, and then get to the point where he was a heavyweight. And of course, he fought past his prime as well. But a number of other guys he was in there with. I mean, you name it. Fred Fulton in there with him, another big heavyweight. Oh, I just named to you some of the greatest heavyweights of all time there, Joe Gans. And I mentioned, or Dan, I mentioned Joe Gans because this puts into perspective that Sam Langford started at that weight and he moved up. He started at that weight, moved up to fight these guys. I just gave you 4 of the greatest heavyweights that the sport has seen. I just gave you 4. Jack Johnson, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills. There's 4 of the greatest heavyweights that the sport has seen. So there are others as well, but what is being factored in? So yeah, you're saying at heavyweight for sure, but put that into perspective that Sam Langford started at below lightweight, and he's able to go up, beat, and knock out some of the greatest heavyweights that the sport has seen. So I think that speaks volumes right there. Other than the amount of time Langford beat them, greatly outnumbers the time they won combined. Certainly. And you're talking about multi-fight rivalries that went into like numbers like 15. I think with Sam McVeigh, he fought him like 15 times. With Harry Wills, somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 times or somewhere in that range, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't just that. And this was all while they were in their fighting primes, especially the great heavyweights. List to Fulton. So I mentioned Fulton on there. You're acting like Langford wasn't like 18 when he fought a prime Gans. Yeah, he was actually 17, I believe it was, and he fought Joe Gans, beat arguably the greatest lightweight of all time. And what I was showing you, or what I was pointing out there, is even in doing such, he went up to heavyweight to knock out heavyweights and carried real power. But there's so much into it. There's some videos out there. We've done some on Random's channel where he dives into it, things of that nature. But yeah, that was he lost to Fulton. Yeah, he was past his prime there. What do you know about Fulton? He was great enough that he would have won the world heavyweight champion. Do you consider Jess Willard great? Because he would have beat Jess Willard without a doubt. There's no question he would have beat Jess Willard. And if you look at the runs that Fulton went on, then I think it will shed light on how good Fulton was at that particular time. So Darkman said, Jonette Wills, Philadelphia, Jack O'Brien, Gumboat Smith, McVeigh, Ketchel, Gans, Jim Flynn, gave a tough time to Johnson. So yeah, there are a number of fighters just across multiple weights there that Yeah, Langford was just, I mean, a beast in there. And apparently Johnson didn't want no parts of Langford after that drawing the color line. Certainly, when he became champion, yeah, and Sam Langford, he was not even a full-fledged heavyweight when he fought Johnson. As a matter of fact, he was the smaller guy coming in there. Oftentimes, he was the smaller guy coming into these contests, and he carried, as I mentioned, that pop all the way up. But you just named some of the people that was in there with a slew of others. The great Jack Blackburn, the man who trained Joe Louis, slew of others. Then Ali lost to a boxer with 7 fights. Losses don't take away the legacy. Certainly. Yeah, Johnson, yeah, he refused to give Langford a fight. The money was there. As a matter of fact, he had signed some agreement, or at least in principle, there was something in place that he was going to fight Langford, and it didn't happen. Yeah, Jack, and actually, when he went to fight Jess Willard, this being Jack Johnson, he had actually stated, and it was on the record, that he was going to actually take on Sam McVeigh if he defeated, or he was confident he was going to defeat Willard, but he claimed he was going to take on Sam McVeigh in Cuba as well. But the rest is history because he didn't get past Willard. But that would have been interesting. I think if those guys would have got a shot at the world heavyweight title, then their greatness would be even more pronounced. We'd have more footage of these individuals, but didn't happen. Oh, and he picked to fight another top black fighter instead of Langford. I think it was Jeanette. Okay. I just gave you the great heavyweights that he beat. You tell me how these heavyweights aren't great that I just named to you. I already named you 4 of the greatest heavyweights the sport has seen. Yeah, everyone has their opinion and they may have a particular area that they lean. But that being said, you go look at their resume. You check out their resume. You can match their resumes up to any of the heavyweights in history. And then we'll see how that goes. They never got a world title shot at heavyweight. These are all guys who were capable of being world heavyweight champions. I just named to you 4 of the greatest, bar none, that the sport has seen in an era of great heavyweights. And that's unquestioned. That's just not me saying that. That's what the guys that are considered historians, the guys that were in and around the sport at that particular time, the accounts that we have, they'll tell you that these guys were some of the greatest heavyweights that the sport has seen. And even at their time, the greatest of the bunch. So is this in relation to James J. Jeffries? Because, like I said, from a resume perspective, it's no match to Sam Langford's. That's just what it is. It's no match to Sam Langford's. Pulling Ball says Langford beat Jeanette 8 times. Jeanette only won once. Beat McVeigh 6 times. Lost twice, and one of them outweighed by almost 50 pounds. And KO Willis twice. Certainly. Lost just as much to these guys. Nah, it wasn't like that. You point out some of these guys who have a huge amount of fights. You get my point. He really didn't beat many great heavyweights. Well, all right. That's your thought there, Dan. That's certainly your thought. But if you look at his resume, heavyweight resume, compare it to James J. Jeffries, I think you won't be shocked, but others would be. So we're in disagreement there. So yeah, I'm not with you. I think that his resume at heavyweight stacks up amongst the best ever. I mean, he fought some of these guys. His combination of fighting those guys was more than Jeffries' official fight count for his career, as far as what those 24 fights that are considered to be his official record. So he fought the those four guys that I mentioned more times than that. And that was just those guys alone. He lost once to Jeanette and twice to McVeigh. Most of his losses to Wills were in like for his literally, yeah, he was a bit past it at that point. He fought well past when he should have. And by that same token, as mentioned, this is a guy who started at below lightweight. I know there are some people who know the specific weight he started at, but he started below lightweight. These are other guys that he were facing. They're heavyweights, legitimate heavyweights, some of the greatest heavyweights that the sport has seen in history. And Langford started at a weight far below that and was able to carry his power up. Yeah, besides the fact that when you fight against the best, you best be ready to lose as much as you win. Mainstream fighters of that era duck them and use the color line as an excuse. Most certainly. Langford Prime lasted until 1914. After that, his weight balloons and he later gets blinded by Fred Fulton. Yeah, in a lot of wars. He was fighting. You look at his weight, what he was weighing in a lot of those contests. Many of these guys were trumping him as far as just the weight in itself was concerned. So yeah, we definitely don't agree right there. So no, I don't get the point. We don't agree right there. So a lot of talking about here reminded me of Canelo and Fury and Benavidez and Usyk. Dan Wills, the Black Panther, was ducked by Dempsey. Certainly, he had a run where he was the best heavyweight in the world. Couldn't get a world heavyweight title shot. I mean, the proof is there in the pudding. But of course, everyone, hey, you can interpret things your own way. Everyone will have their opinion. Everyone will lean towards who they want to lean towards. So Joe Louis isn't to everyone what he is to some, same with Langford, same with Dempsey, same with Will, same with Ali, same with freaking Tyson, same with Riddick Bowe, same with Tyson Fury. Yeah, it just varies. It just varies without a doubt. It varies. Same with Gene Tunney. And Sam wanted to get him and knocked him out. There are those who consider Gene Tunney the greatest heavyweight of all time. If you look at his heavyweight resume, take off those two Dempsey wins, or at least include those two Dempsey wins, then I think you'd be hard pressed in saying he had the type of resume at the heavyweight level to solidify that claim. Did he look good? Most certainly. So, in other words, it's basically to each his or her own. Everyone is going to have the direction that they're leaning, but most certainly Sam Langford, one of the great heavyweights and beyond. Langford literally beat every heavyweight of the era not named Johnson or Jeffries. How is he not great? Most certainly. And that was just that heavyweight. Mind you, couldn't get a title shot. Couldn't get a title shot at heavyweight. And had Johnson done it, had Johnson given either Jeanette Langford, or had he given Jeanette Langford, Wills probably wouldn't have happened just given the time, but had he given Jeanette Langford or McVeigh a title shot, it would have certainly been a case where he would have exchanged, the title would have exchanged hands. If all three of those guys would have gotten a title shot, not a 100% given, but the title would have certainly exchanged hands. Most certainly. If Lewis said Lewis didn't beat anyone, even if you include Dempsey in Tunney's heavyweight resume, it still sucks. Yeah, right. Some people think he's the greatest heavyweight all time. You're just being retarded. Please quote where I said Lewis didn't beat anyone. Oh, wait, can't see because it never ever happened. Yeah, I recall the conversation. We're talking about some of his best wins being against some of the smaller guys. And then we were talking about some of the bigger guys that he was in there with who had pretty solid and formidable careers. But certainly Billy Khan, one of those all-timers. He was a good win for him. Of course, he was in there with others, Ezzard Charles. I mean, yeah, just a ton of them for sure. But certainly, I think that, big picture, Yeah, Sam Langford. He has a resume to uh, stand up. Well, saying both of those things that Lewis didn't beat anyone and Langford not being great are wrong if we're speaking about facts. Right, right, right. That is true. That is true. I mean, Lewis had the uh, Lewis had the most title defenses in heavyweight history. 25. He has a lot of accolades, things that stack up, and just a formidable fighter. Formidable fighter for sure. Sorry, I meant to quote me where I said Lewis didn't beat anyone because I legit never said it. No, I don't recall you saying he didn't beat anyone. No, I don't recall you saying that. I remember the discussion was on whether his best wins were against the smaller guys. Hey, and I threw out a number of who many would consider top caliber contenders from that era and challengers that he was in there with, the likes of the Polino Uskaduns. I mean, I think, was he in there with King Levinsky? I can't remember off top who was in there with, but certainly, you know, there were a number of guys that came across his resume who had standing. So it wasn't just the Langford beat all the greatest heavyweights ever. I was just kidding. He didn't beat all of them, but he beat pretty much the majority of the best heavyweights of his era multiple times in most cases. No one beat all of them because no one could fight all of them. But most certainly, Langford has a heavyweight resume that can be matched up against pretty much anyone, for sure. Luther McCarthy, who would have McCarthy would have beat Fulton Willard. Too bad the Wild Bronc broke his neck. He didn't know he had the break when he fell dead from a simple jab from Pelkey. All right, salute, Alex. Yeah, I looked that up. Yeah, man, yeah, that was crazy because you told me about that one day on one of these lives. Certainly someone I want to dive into further. Might have to do a video on that. That was pretty crazy. But yeah, I saw that, how he, man, just as he was kind of getting that backing and people were certainly looking forward to him, he got hit and was out. And man, yeah, that's crazy. So that was a good thing to share there. I didn't know of him there, Alexander, but interesting story. Yeah, it would have been interesting to see how he would have done with Fulton. Yeah, so probably capable, because the thing that derailed Fulton, certainly when he ran into some big punchers, and of course when he went up against some pretty solid top tier boxers, Billy Misk, who was a smaller guy, could outbox him for sure. But that would be interesting. I need to dive more into Luke McCarthy, but he might have been capable of doing so right there, Alexander. Well, certainly, I'm going to check into it a bit more, but I did look him up when you mentioned him. And yeah, that's pretty crazy. Sad story for it to go down like that. Poland, I would destroy you in Call of Duty. 2K. Yeah. Cool. UFC or Fight Night. Well, yeah, I'm not good in that UFC game. Certainly not good there. Rodolfo, you're not good enough in that game to be playing that. Oh, stand and bang. Crazy thing, we started talking about the great Boilermaker. We ended up talking about Langford greatness. Hey, it happens like that sometimes. Dark man, salute. It happens like that. That's right. Hey, they all tend to take on their own life, you know, but cool. It's all great, all good stuff, most certainly. You know, hey, this is what invokes the thought. Hey, at the end of the day, everyone has an opinion, and some people favor certain things over the other. You know, is there really a right or wrong answer? No, that's a question to be asked. I know I have those things that I lean towards, that I favor, just as anyone does. So those are all things that kind of have to be thrown in the mix. So it's good stuff. But man, it's been great. Great discussion there. Ended on Langford. That seems apropos right there. Why not? Let's end it on the great Sam Langford. But of course, many salutes and shout outs to the great Boilermaker, James J. Jeffries. Do you think Jeffries poses any threat to Ali? I think he might be too slow, but has that left hook, which always troubled Ali. Yeah, someone had mentioned that. I briefly touched on it. I think Ali's too fast, moves a bit too well. The footwork is too great, but certainly, yeah, I think he could touch up Ali if he cornered him. He got him in situations where Ali tired, wasn't moving as much, and decided to lean up against the ropes, things of that nature. Then that doesn't bode too well for him, especially in the latter portion of the fight there, Poland Ball. But in terms of just at their best heyday, yeah, I have Ali over pretty much anyone. I have Ali pretty much over anyone. So that makes it interesting. Ali Boumai. Yeah. After Dempsey KO'd Fulton, he fought 14 more guys before Willard. If I recall correct, so you're saying after Dempsey KO'd Fulton, he fought 14 more times, as in Dempsey or Fulton? I know Fulton. Yeah, after he lost to Dempsey, he went on a run. I believe it was the undefeated streak, and then he lost to Harry Wills. Yeah, but the Fulton fight was pretty much what got him his title shot. He said that's a myth that the Fulton fight was who got to fight Willard. There was certainly mention of that fight actually being one that the public was viewing as two individuals who would be facing Willard. So I know there were mention and clamoring in that regard. There was some mention of such. Yeah, he got sparked by Dempsey. So you're saying Dempsey fought 14 more times before fighting Willard? I don't remember him fighting that many more times before fighting Willard. The Fulton fight, what was that in? So Wills beat him in 1918. So maybe, but yeah, I can't remember off top. I need to look that up. But I know there were rumblings. I know, of course, tied to that fight for sure, as it related to them potentially facing Jess Willard. But Fulton and Willard should have already fought prior to that. In actuality, Fulton should have fought Willard prior. You know, I mentioned in the video they actually participated in a little exhibition when Fulton was on a tour. Fulton was on a tour against or he was on a, not Fulton was on a tour, but Jess Willard was on a tour. He came to Minnesota and he and Fulton did a little exhibition, something of that nature. And yeah, so it was pretty interesting. But yeah, so but yeah, one of those interesting things there. But yeah, Fulton and Willard, they should have fought very early. Langford was a great fighter, but none of you ever have him in top 5, etc. heavyweights, or even mention top ever here in the top 5, etc. heavyweights. He was arguably the greatest fighter of all time. He did a lot of work at heavyweight. Yeah, I don't have him over Lewis or Ali. Certainly, I think there are some other heavyweights you can make an argument. Would he have beat Jack Johnson the second time around? You know, it's not a definitive thing, even if he was there at full-fledged heavyweight, but certainly he would have been game. But yeah, he rates highly. He has a resume to back it. He has some wins over some of the greatest heavyweights in history. I think Langford is greater pound for pound than he is heavyweight. Hey, many regard Langford as the number one pound for pound fighter. Certainly, he applied his trade well beyond heavyweight. We mentioned where he started at. It was well below, and he was in there with some of everybody. Some of the names we mentioned: Barbados Joe Walcott, of course, another one, former world welterweight champion there. So Langford was in there with him. I mean, you just name it. It's just a slew of individuals. I mean, he was in there with Tiger Flowers, for peak's sake, former world middleweight champion, and seemingly of a different era. So Langford fought too long for sure, and that's one of the things we surely pointed out. But very interesting stuff. All right, folks. Yeah, it's been great. Going bordering 3 hours here. You know, time flies. Time certainly flies. Man, it's been a great discussion. Appreciate everyone joining in. Of course, we'll discuss more. We'd love to have those discussions. I'm sure this won't be the end of it. Hey, that's your stance. Hey, you can stick to it, Dan, for sure. Hey, it's at the end of the day, everyone has those things that tie to him. Him or her. I rate him as a top caliber heavyweight, but certainly I don't rate him as the greatest heavyweight of all time. I don't rate him as the greatest heavyweight of all time. But greatest fighter, I mean, when it's all added into the mix, I mean, standout stuff right there. Standout stuff. So, yeah, thanks everyone that dropped in. Appreciate you all. We'll have to do these discussions again. And we'll continue to, dive into the history. We agree that, I don't rate Langford as the greatest heavyweight of all time, but I do have him in my top 5. So that's where we stand in difference right there, Dan. But hey, to each his own for the next man. Yeah, good argument for top 10. Certainly. Some world heavyweight titles would have elevated things in some sense. But yeah, one of those things. But yeah, Ali, I rate him number 1 in the heavyweight game. So that's my guy right there as far as that's concerned. But with that being said, man, thanks. We're going to dive into this more. We might just have a discussion simply on that. Look at Sam Langford as a heavyweight and get some more thoughts surrounding that. But until then, appreciate everyone. We'll be back in the mix here